welcome to the channel. If you enjoy captivating stories and intriguing content, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss an update. Also, drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. I love seeing the amazing places our community comes from. Thanks for being here, and let's dive in. By late autumn, the paper mill in Saginaw had learned to move with the hush of snow outside its windows. It was an old-fashioned place for brick buildings, a sawtooth roof, and a lonely river that carried pulp away like pale smoke on the current. Inside, accounts payable rested in the hands of Trevor Miles, a man whose iron shirts and gentle nods seemed to promise reliability. He was 43, kept a bonsai on his desk, and never left for lunch without wiping every smudge from his calculator screen. For 15 years, Trevor balanced the mill's books so quietly that executives stopped thinking of them as something that required attention. The CFO, a gregarious golfer named Reeves, assumed the monthly summaries were produced by software. What Reeves saw were neat columns of figures and a green checkmark in the corner of every report. What Trevor saw were numbers that pulsed like small engines, begging to be tweaked for smoother rhythm. It began with a single transfer. $1,940 from an unclaimed vendor refund slid into a personal account he had opened under the name T. Morrison. He stared at the screen for 40 seconds, then clicked accept. Nothing happened. The world did not tilt. Outside, a forklift beeped as if agreeing that life had resumed its regular pace. The ease of that moment coaxed him forward. Trevor located other forgotten sums. Rebates for paper chemicals, postage reimbursements, rebates from a trucking company that had changed its billing platform. He would move the money on late Friday afternoons while the plant manager held his weekly safety briefing. Each transfer stayed below $5,000, a threshold he believed would evade automated detection. The amounts were so small compared to the mill's $40 million revenue stream that the balance sheet sighed and turned the page. At home, Trevor told his wife Diane that the extra cash came from consulting on a friend's startup. Diane, who taught second grade and trusted balanced voices over daring ones, nodded. They used the money to pay off their sedan sooner, then to redo the kitchen with slate countertops that felt cool under the morning coffee mug. Trevor discovered a pleasure in silent upgrades. Fresh paint, a smart thermostat, a bottle of Bourgogne over dinner. Each purchase was modest enough to avoid boasting, yet fancy enough to feel like a kept secret. 2 winters later, the pulp market tightened, and layoffs sliced through the mill like sudden frost. Anxiety crept into corridors, and Reeves, pressed by the board, requested a granular cost review. Trevor worked late producing the audit, his heart flickering like the fluorescent bulbs above him. He buried the stolen sums inside a shadow ledger, creating fictional vendor codes that matched real supplier names with a 1-digit difference. He cross-referenced them with phony invoice numbers, and when the CFO skimmed the report, nothing looked out of place. Trevor felt an exhilarating chill. Deception had become a craft he could practice under pressure. Then a strange ripple disrupted his equilibrium. A junior accountant named Lila Chin, newly hired from a Detroit firm, was asked to migrate old records into a cloud platform. She noticed that vendor 307815 and vendor 308715 both supplied sodium chlorate, yet their pricing histories diverged wildly. She marked it in a margin note, curious rather than suspicious, and asked Trevor if the mill sometimes routed orders through sister companies. Trevor smiled, said it happened occasionally, and offered to handle that portion himself. Lila, polite, agreed, but the lingering oddity tugged at her mind. Weeks passed. The river thawed, revealing dark water and logs drifting like lost sentences. Lila, who enjoyed puzzles, reopened the vendor files after hours. She traced the phony invoices to bank transactions flagged as internal adjustments, each signed off by Trevor. A cluster of them landed every third Friday at 5:12 p.m. She printed the evidence, slid it into a manila envelope, and debated her next step during a long drive home where the radio crackled with late-night jazz. The following Monday, Reeves called Trevor into the glass-walled conference room. Snowflakes brushed the panes as if trying to listen. On the table lay Lila's envelope, neatly opened. Reeves's golfing joviality had vanished, replaced by the brittle tone of a man confronting an unfamiliar sport. He asked Trevor to explain the duplicate vendors. Trevor's pulse hammered. He considered denial, but the printouts were explicit. Instead, he cited financial stress, tuition for 2 children, medical bills for Diane's father, the creeping fear of redundancy in an automated world. The words sounded thin and rehearsed even to him. Human resources suspended Trevor pending an external audit. He drove home through falling snow, each streetlight casting barred shadows across the windshield. Diane stood in the doorway, holding a mug of tea she'd intended to share after her day of parent-teacher conferences. She listened as he confessed, her eyes widening not in anger but in dawning distance, as though she were watching him recede down a hallway that lengthened with every sentence. Federal investigators arrived within weeks. They calculated that Trevor had siphoned $1.6 million over 6 years, an average of $512 a day, the cost of a gentle hobby disguised as necessity. In court he sat beneath fluorescents identical to those in his office, hands folded, shoulders rounded inward like parentheses around his shrinking world. He pled guilty to wire fraud and money laundering. The judge, noting Trevor's cooperation and lack of lavish lifestyle, imposed 48 months in federal prison and ordered restitution that would outlive Trevor's career prospects. Back in Saginaw, the mill survived by merging with a Scandinavian conglomerate. Reeves retired early citing health. Lila was promoted. On her first day as controller, she stood by the river at dawn, the water moving past with a whispering steadiness. She understood that numbers could murmur too, but only if someone cared to listen when the rest of the world assumed silence meant everything was in order. On a damp March morning in London, when the Thames looked like tarnished pewter and the commuter crowd moved with umbrella-hunched precision, Jonathan Rook arrived at Helix Capital 1 hour before trading opened. The glass tower near St. Paul's still smelled faintly of new carpet, as though the building itself hadn't decided whether to welcome or intimidate its occupants. Jonathan, 32, wore that ambiguity like a tailored suit. Colleagues said his manners were schoolboy gentle, yet rumors clung to him. A scholarship boy from Sheffield who mastered options pricing the way some children conquer chess. Helix Capital thrived on speed, but Jonathan cultivated deliberation. He kept a brass fountain pen beside his dual monitors and always paused 5 seconds before hitting send on an order ticket, as if letting the market confess something in that sliver of silence. Partners loved quoting his track record: 4 consecutive quarters of double-digit returns in the European aerospace sector. They called him the Canary, a nod to miners' birds that sensed hidden dangers first. Jonathan pretended to dislike the nickname, though in private he enjoyed the latent promise in it. If he sang, people listened. What most did not know, including the compliance team 2 floors below, was that Jonathan's songbook included notes whispered over encrypted chat by Eliza Hartley, a regulatory analyst at the Civil Aviation Authority. They had met at a conference reception where Prosecco and fluorescent lights conspired to cast her files on aircraft safety upgrades as thrilling secrets. Eliza's role was administrative, codifying reports, scheduling inspections, but the data logged in her password-protected spreadsheets could tilt share prices of the 3 big jet engine manufacturers by billions. Jonathan understood this within minutes. Eliza realized it only later, over coffee, when he asked questions a mere casual acquaintance should not know to ask. Yet she kept answering. Partly she enjoyed feeling essential to someone who inhabited the high-frequency world she glimpsed only in headlines. Partly she liked Jonathan's quiet laughter and the way he folded his glasses when he concentrated. Their informality grew inside discreet lunch spots near Victoria Station. Eliza passed along inspection outcomes before public release. Jonathan rewarded her with careful gratitude and gift cards she could plausibly claim came from a corporate raffle. Nothing extravagant. £50 here, a spa voucher there. He thought of the payments as courtesy tokens, a phrase that, spoken aloud, might have frozen both of them with its brittle absurdity. For 11 months the arrangement glided like a well-serviced jet. Jonathan placed trades hours before downgrades hit press wires. When a fuel pump flaw forced the grounding of an entire fleet in Spain, Helix shorted the manufacturer's stock at dawn and profited before lunch. Bonuses accumulated. Jonathan upgraded from a rented flat in Shoreditch to a Victorian terrace in Islington, telling friends he had finally leveraged his potential, a euphemism broad enough to invite admiration without interrogation. The fault line appeared one Friday afternoon, subtle as a hairline crack in a turbine blade. Eliza messaged, "Preliminary data on Falcon 900EX, engine vibration issues. Preliminary only, not confirmed." Jonathan, impatient, because profit favored certainty, pressed for more. She hesitated, then attached an internal memo flagged in red, "Potential recall under review." He shorted 15 million shares before the memo was even downloaded at the regulator's headquarters. But Monday arrived with a press release stating that the vibration readings were false positives, sensors miscalibrated during routine maintenance. Shares rocketed upward by 12%, erasing years of Jonathan's celebrated consistency in a single morning. Losses of this magnitude could not hide in any department's cushions. The risk desk froze his positions, demanded a timeline. Jonathan produced charts demonstrating a thesis reversal, claiming he'd misread publicly available signals. Compliance nodded, uneasy, and scheduled an internal review. But the real threat brewed far from Helix Capital, in a cubicle lined with aviation-themed calendars. Eliza had spent the weekend reading about an American case in which a federal employee went to prison for sharing product safety findings with a hedge fund. She imagined her own name in courtroom transcripts and felt a nausea deeper than fear, the realization that she had mistaken Jonathan's charm for solidarity. Tuesday morning she reported the leak to her department head. By Thursday, the Financial Conduct Authority's Market Abuse Unit had subpoenaed chat logs that mapped the clandestine relay of information message by truncated message. Investigators moved with unhurried precision, trained to notice psychological breadcrumbs as much as digital ones. They saw how Jonathan called Eliza "songbird," a term that turned their dynamic into a private duet. They noted her gradual shift from exclamation marks to curt full stops, proof that conscience, like any instrument, produces a change in tone before the ear can name it. Helix's managing partner, a man whose confidence normally filled a trading floor like amplified jazz, sat across from Jonathan in a glass office that suddenly felt too transparent. He spoke softly, "We need to know, absolutely, if this is more than bad luck." Jonathan's mind searched for the old 5-second pause, but panic devoured it. He asked for a solicitor. The interview ended. Arrest came without spectacle. 2 detectives waited by the revolving doors at street level, one holding an umbrella that dripped steady raindrops onto the marble floor. Jonathan was calm, almost relieved, as if the rhythm of footsteps and handcuffs replaced months of accelerating heartbeat. Outside, cameras clicked beneath overcast sky. Inside, traders exhaled a collective breath they hadn't realized they were holding. Eliza's testimony outlined 26 information transfers. The prosecution framed them as deliberate choreography, a phrase that made Jonathan picture their lunches replayed under harsh fluorescent courtroom lights. He pled guilty to insider dealing, accepted a 4-year sentence, and agreed to forfeit the terrace he had barely furnished. Eliza, granted leniency for cooperation, received a suspended sentence and a lifetime ban from regulatory work, a penalty she felt more keenly than prison walls. Months later, commuters still flowed past Helix Capital's tower, unaware that a department once nicknamed the Canary Desk no longer existed. In distant prison silence, Jonathan sometimes recalled how miners carried canaries underground not just to warn of poison, but because birdsong made the darkness feel less absolute. He found himself listening for echoes now, but no melody rose, only the steady hum of locked doors and the faint hiss of a world that had learned, however briefly, to stop listening when the wrong voice decided to sing. At dawn, the Lombard Plains looked as tranquil as a postcard, neat rows of poplar trees, mist curling over alfalfa fields, the scent of warmed hay rising with the sun. In the small city of Colecchio, trucks bearing the blue La Tenera logo, and utter stylized into a smile, rolled toward distribution hubs across Europe. By volume, the dairy conglomerate was Italy's quiet giant, delivering cartons of milk and bricks of shelf-stable cream to 27 countries. Most consumers never wondered who kept the rivers of revenue flowing. Inside headquarters, that responsibility was said to rest with one man, Chief Financial Officer Arturo Benassi. Benassi was 51, slim, and almost aggressively polite. He wore gray suits that seemed to reflect neither sun nor office fluorescence, and he spoke in phrases as measured as metronome clicks. Shareholders cherished him. In quarterly calls, his voice stayed level even when global milk prices swung like a skittish herd. He explained foreign exchange exposures in plain Italian before switching to fluent English for the analysts. By the end of each session, listeners felt soothed, as though volatility were merely a subplot destined to resolve itself by next quarter. Yet numbers possess a music of their own, and Arturo had learned to compose variations no one else could hear. Years earlier, as Latenera expanded into South America, he set up a holding entity in the Cayman Islands called Sunfield Limited. The board signed off, believing it was a tax-efficient way to manage export receipts. In truth, Sunfield soon hosted a second set of books where losses evaporated and profits multiplied like yeast. Each time global dairy demand dipped, Arturo arranged for Sunfield to purchase receivables from the parent company, paying with promissory notes he drafted on a template file locked behind a triple password. Every transaction fit within a single afternoon's work. Download statements, adjust line items, upload refreshed PDFs to the board portal. No alarms sounded. Auditors, lulled by Latenera's mundane product line, reviewed samples rather than full populations. And so the fiction grew, layer upon layer, like cream thickening in silence. Arturo never pocketed cash outright. His reward lay in status. Invitations to speak at Milan Business School, private boxes at La Scala, a discreet upgrade from a modest condominium to a hillside villa overlooking Parma's twinkling nighttime grid. His wife, Lucia, an art restorer, found the house beautiful but wondered aloud how a dairy salary alone afforded such splendor. Arturo answered with gentle humor, stock options, forward contracts, a favorable moment in the euro-real spread. Even Lucia, whose craft demanded patience and microscopic scrutiny, chose to trust the narrative the way fresco pigments trust the plaster beneath them. The first tremor arrived one July when a junior treasury analyst named Sofia Conti reconciled cash flows ahead of a bond issuance. She noticed that an offshore receipt of 95 million euros was backed by a scanned bank confirmation bearing a signature that looked slightly pixelated at the edges, as though copied one time too many. Curious more than suspicious, she emailed the Cayman Bank's relationship manager. The reply was brief: "We show no such deposit on record." Sofia reported the inconsistency to her supervisor, who forwarded it to Arturo for clarification. Arturo thanked them, promised to investigate, and within an hour produced a revised confirmation with sharper resolution and a new transaction number. The supervisor, relieved, deleted the earlier thread. But Sofia saved a copy on a thumb drive she carried home, where, after dinner, she studied the document again. A single digit in the SWIFT code belonged not to any Cayman branch but to a regional bank in Sao Paulo. The error was tiny, like a hairline crack in porcelain, yet she felt it would worsen if tapped. Days later, bond investors convened in Milan's Excelsior Hotel. Arturo stood behind a lucite lectern, presenting Latenera's liquidity position with slides shaded in comforting pastel blues. Sofia, relegated to the back of the room, watched him glide through figures she now doubted. Her stomach tightened each time the word robust appeared beside charts that, if her hunch was right, were castles on vapor. Unable to sleep that night, Sofia drafted a whistleblower letter to Italy's market regulator, Consa. She hesitated over the send button, aware that careers could sour faster than unchilled milk. At dawn, she clicked anyway, attaching the disputed confirmations and a table of mismatched SWIFT codes. Regulators arrived discreetly 2 weeks later, requesting electronic backups to resolve a minor reporting query. Arturo greeted them with espresso and courteous smiles. He supplied files on a thumb drive identical to Sofia's, except these showed Sunfield holding genuine cash, backed by new statements from yet another offshore bank. The investigators thanked him and left, but as they compared metadata, they spotted a pattern. Every statement had been generated by the same PDF software on the same computer, time-stamped at 2:17 a.m. local time, even when ostensibly issued in Cayman business hours. The music of the numbers was finally off-key. In October, news broke. Latenera's offshore cash was a mirage. 8.9 billion euros had evaporated. Trading in the company's shares halted. Supermarkets pulled promotional posters. Farmers in the Po Valley stared at silent milking machines, wondering whether invoices would ever be paid. Cameras camped outside headquarters, capturing a bewildered herd of employees clutching boxed lunches they suddenly couldn't swallow. Arturo was arrested while closing the shutters of his villa against an early autumn chill. He did not resist. In interviews he spoke almost clinically of maintaining stability amid price shocks, as though conjuring billions was a sophisticated form of dairy homogenization. Prosecutors were unmoved. They charged him with false accounting, market manipulation, and criminal conspiracy. Lucia testified that she never suspected fraud. Her voice cracked only when describing how Arturo once compared well-kept ledgers to milk that never sours. Sophia declined press requests. She returned to a quiet apartment where she watered a fern and answered text messages from friends who now called her brave. The word felt too large. In truth, she'd acted less from courage than from the stubborn intuition that numbers, like living creatures, give off subtle heat when forced into unnatural shapes. Months later, as court proceedings dragged on, the Lombard fields remained green, the cows untroubled by human arithmetic. But every so often, a passing truck bore a new logo, evidence that another conglomerate had purchased La Tenera's assets at auction. Residents on country roads still waved at the drivers, though a trace of caution lingered in the gesture, as if even the simplest commodity could hide a secret ledger no one had thought to question until the carton was already empty. 80 minutes before sunrise, the Charles River still held its breath under a glaze of winter ice, and the brick facades of Cambridge threw back only the faintest hints of dawn. In a renovated textile warehouse near Kendall Square, Gideon Hale unlocked the glass doors of Meridian Wealth Partners and felt the usual prickle of satisfaction. At 39 he looked more professor than financier, corduroy blazer, wire-rimmed spectacles, a mop of dark hair he never bothered to tame, yet prestigious alumni magazines hailed him as the visionary behind America's fastest-growing crowd-powered fixed-income fund. Investors pictured an algorithm humming with neutral brilliance. Gideon preferred they never pictured him at all. What Meridian promised was elegant simplicity. Thousands of small loans to blue-chip suppliers, micro-invoices bundled, rated, and streamed into high-yield portfolios. Gideon's slide decks showed tidy arrows from vendor to platform to investor, as if money merely changed fonts on its way to multiplying. He toured retirement seminars explaining how the fund's machine learning engine split risk, like white light through a prism, producing steady 8% returns uncorrelated with the stock market. During Q&A, elderly teachers asked whether their savings were really safe. Gideon answered with patient warmth, invoking cash reserves and insured custodians. He left out the part where those reserves were already spoken for and the custodians were, in truth, just subsidiaries with post office box addresses. 3 floors below Gideon's office, Meridian's operations room gleamed with open-plan minimalism. Standing desks, diffused lighting, and a 6-foot touch screen displaying animated circles that pulsed green whenever payments cleared. What new hires didn't realize was that the data feed behind the circles looped the same 72-hour clip on repeat. Gideon had built the visual in a single weekend, splicing authentic transactions from Meridian's first profitable quarter. "No one doubts a screen that moves," he joked to his lieutenant, Clara Vance. Clara, once a municipal bond trader who could sense yield spreads the way sailors sense weather, laughed too loudly, then bit her lip as if to tuck the sound back in. She managed the internal ledger, a database that stored real invoices in one folder and phantom ones in another, distinguished only by a final digit that toggled between 7 and 9. Toggle 9 meant money flowing in. Toggle 7 meant the same money recycled out to pay earlier investors, an elegant braid disguising emptiness. For 18 months the braid held, tightening each time Gideon staged a fresh capital raise. Journalists applauded Meridian's social mission, helping Main Street vendors escape predatory credit cards, but none requested a vendor list. Gideon took comfort in that omission the way a tightrope walker trusts a well-timed spotlight. Scrutiny existed, but it faced the wrong direction. He and Clara kept a countdown spreadsheet marked net new cash required. Whenever the red cell neared zero, Gideon scheduled a podcast appearance or drafted a Medium essay about democratizing finance. Money followed applause with obedient rhythm, like waves trailing a ferry. The first hairline crack appeared not in the ledger but in Gideon's inbox, disguised as admiration. A graduate student at MIT Sloan School, Neha Patel, requested anonymized loan data for her thesis on alternative credit models. Gideon nearly declined, then reasoned that partial disclosure might polish Meridian's mystique. He sent a CSV stripped of borrower names yet forgot to scrub one column. Invoice creation timestamp. Neha, applying a tool that visualized clusters, noticed an impossible symmetry. Exactly 512 invoices originated at 9:03 p.m. every third Thursday, regardless of vendor size or geography. She emailed Clara with polite curiosity, copying Gideon. Clara drafted a soothing reply about batch uploads, but saved it to drafts. unsettled by a pulse of guilt that felt like vertigo at the edge of a high dive. That same week, Meridian prepared for a $150 million Series C round led by a Silicon Valley fund whose partners believed disruption should move fast and break the yield curve. Due diligence meant a one-day visit. Gideon rehearsed talking points, looping in Clara through a Bluetooth headset while she drove to her aging father's nursing home. Traffic lights blurred. Clara heard Gideon's voice describing capital adequacy ratios, and suddenly pictured her father's frail hands, veins crossing like blue wires under translucent skin. She wondered which column in the phantom ledger equaled his monthly care fee. A single wrong toggle and the hands would lose their grip on everything. The investors arrived on a Tuesday sharp with early morning optimism. Gideon guided them past the glowing touch screen, offered espresso, and opened a live dashboard, this time connected to real transactions, a limited stream he considered safe. Yet the dashboard hiccuped. A supplier in Ohio had filed for Chapter 11 overnight, freezing $2.7 million in receivables. The green circle twitched to amber. One partner raised an eyebrow. Gideon clicked to enlarge another vendor's payment history, talking quickly about isolated credit events. The room's oxygen felt thinner. In a corner, Clara watched his hands shake. She knew the true accounts couldn't absorb the loss. The braid was fraying in public view. That evening, long after the visitors departed with guarded smiles, Clara returned to the office. Gideon sat in darkness, illuminated only by the river's reflected street lamps, staring at the countdown spreadsheet now flashing negative. He asked if she still believed they could outrun the shortfall. Clara, voice hoarse, offered a different arithmetic. If they self-reported, investors might recover 40 cents on the dollar and regulators might show leniency. Gideon listened, eyes blank, then uttered a sentence as flat as printer paper: "We keep walking until the floor disappears." Clara drove home through snow she didn't remember forecast, the steering wheel slick beneath her gloves. 2 mornings later, Neha Patel forwarded her anomaly chart to a friend interning at the SEC's Boston office. The agency quietly subpoenaed Meridian's bank records. A junior examiner cross-checked routing numbers, finding payments that circled among Meridian, 2 shell custodians, and back to Meridian in under 48 hours, funds sprinting in place. Within a week, agents occupied the warehouse lobby, badges glinting in January light. Gideon surrendered without protest, placing his spectacles carefully in a breast pocket as if they might still help him see a version of the world where the braid held. Court filings alleged a $620 million Ponzi scheme. Gideon's defense cited liquidity mismatch exacerbated by pandemic disruptions, but emails revealed intent to deceive as early as the Series A raise. Clara, cooperating with prosecutors, described Toggle 7 and Toggle 9 in a monotone that left reporters scribbling the phrase binary betrayal. Gideon received 16 years in federal prison. Clara 18 months for wire fraud conspiracy, reduced for testimony. Senior investors wrote off losses as innovation risk, while retirees in smaller towns learned their monthly checks would cease before spring. On foggy mornings, scullers still glide across the Charles, slicing gray water with practiced grace. They pass the darkened warehouse and see nothing unusual. Berlin after dark keeps its own rhythm. U-Bahn trains clatter like distant typewriters, neon cafes wink through mist, and the river spree slides between warehouses that have traded coal dust for coating hubs. On Kopenicker Strasse, the newest of those hubs is Vitrion Optics, a 4-story building of smoked glass whose corridors smell of fresh circuitry and designer coffee beans. The company manufactures photonic chips, slivers of silicon that guide light instead of current, and investors describe the technology as the next electricity. Inside Vitrion's secure wing, every door requires a fingerprint and a passphrase, yet the person who would eventually steal the crown jewel walks through reception each morning greeted by name. Her badge reads Dr. Eva Lindholm, Senior Research Engineer. At 34 she has the gravity of someone older. Cropped hair, neutral dresses, and attention span calibrated to lasers whisper-thin tolerances. Colleagues respect her serenity. They do not know it hides a tension wound tight as piano wire. Eva's father, a retired machinist in Malmö, is 3 years into an aggressive leukemia trial that Swedish insurance will cover only in part. Bills arrive monthly, polite as snowfall, but they stack higher than her salary. When she sits alone in her Friedrichshain flat, spreadsheets of dosage costs overlay the schematics glowing on her laptop. and sometimes she cannot remember which set of numbers belongs to hope and which to science. One October evening, after an all-hands meeting celebrating a milestone prototype, Eva finds a folded note in her lab coat pocket. The handwriting is angular, almost architectural. If you ever need an alternate funding source, call this number. A friend of light. She looks around the empty lab. The hum of refrigeration units answers with indifference. The note seems absurd at first, like a prank from over-caffeinated interns. Yet when her father's latest invoice shows a doubled chemotherapy charge, the memory of that angular script returns, glowing in her mind the way laser pathways glow under infrared goggles. On a rainy Sunday she dials the number. A man who calls himself Victor answers in lightly accented German, offers no last name, and wastes no syllables. His proposition is surgical. Vitrien's unreleased Helios chip commands €1 billion licensing value. His client, a Shenzhen consortium, will pay Eva $200,000 in Bitcoin for the design files and an additional $50,000 for the fabrication tolerances hidden in an auxiliary server. No physical samples, no chemicals, only data, he says, as if that distinction erases the moral weight. Eva's first response is silence, but silence itself can be read. Victor interprets it as negotiation room and emails her a contract so brief it could fit on a postcard. 3 deliverables, staggered payments, total anonymity. The sum equals 7 years of her net salary and covers her father's entire treatment plan plus mortgage. For 2 nights she walks the Oberbaum Bridge in drizzle, watching city lights ripple on water, a mosaic broken and repaired with every current. The question that haunts her is not whether she can breach security, she helped design it, but whether crossing the line will fracture the person she believes herself to be. In the end she convinces herself of a cruel algebra. 1 stolen file versus a human life. She emails Victor a single word. Yes. Her method is elegant. Each Helios schematic exists on an air-gapped workstation whose only egress is a weekly backup to magnetic tape. Eva volunteers for the midnight backup rotation, citing insomnia. Alone with the humming tape drive, she slides in a fresh cartridge. But before the checksum completes she pauses the process and runs a hidden script that copies the directory onto a microSD inserted in the drive's maintenance port. The act takes 41 seconds. During that time an overhead camera records only her calm posture, unaware that the drive's internal logging has been disabled by a firmware patch she wrote months earlier, ostensibly to improve efficiency. She mails the microSD in a hollowed-out fountain pen body to a rented box in Warsaw, per Victor's instructions. 3 days later, the first cryptocurrency tranche arrives. She wires euros to Malmo General, labeling the transfer "Family Assistance." Her father calls, voice bright for the first time in weeks. The relief that floods her nearly drowns the guilt, nearly but not entirely. Vitrien's head of cybersecurity, Lucas Newman, notices the firmware patch during a routine audit. At first it looks benign, a timestamp inconsistency. Yet Lucas, a former ethical hacker, treats inconsistencies like loose threads on a Kevlar vest, trivial until someone pulls. He spends a weekend reconstructing device logs from residual magnetic imprint. The pattern reveals a single abnormal data spike at midnight 2 Fridays prior. Lucas eyes the staff rotation list and sees Eva's name. He remembers her precise questions in earlier meetings about backup redundancy, questions that seemed academic at the time. Instead of alerting the board, Lucas decides to confirm his suspicion quietly. He programs a honeypot, a dummy directory labeled Helios version 4.1, market release. Hidden within is a watermark that phones home the moment any file is opened outside Vitrien's firewall. The next backup night, Eva repeats her maneuver, unaware of the bait. 48 hours later, a watermark signal pings from an IP block registered to an apartment complex in Prague leased by a shell company with Chinese board members. Monday dawns brittle with frost. Lucas heats coffee he knows he will not finish, walks to the CEO's office, and closes the door behind him. By lunchtime, Eva is summoned to a conference room where 3 people wait: the CEO, Lucas, and an attorney whose notebook already lists statutes. Eva does not deny the breach. The evidence is crystalline. She offers only the sentence, "I needed to keep someone alive." There is a long pause during which even the HVAC seems to hush, as though the building itself wishes to hear what forgiveness might sound like. None arrives. German prosecutors charge her with industrial espionage and violation of export control laws. Victor evaporates. The second payment never lands. In court she sits small in a gray suit, the very color of her earlier life. Her father attends, frail but determined, and when verdict day comes, 3 years imprisonment, plus restitution he cannot help pay, he squeezes her hand so tightly it hurts. She tries to think of that pain as a tether to a self she fears she has lost. Months later, Vitrion announces a delayed but successful Helios launch. Investors cheer the resilience. Lucas installs redundant sensors on every air-gap device, yet he sometimes wonders whether any system can guard against the arithmetic of desperation. On winter evenings the spree keeps moving, surface unbroken, carrying city lights past the glass building where one choice rewrote a life. The river will not tell what it saw, it simply reflects whatever stands beside it, neon, mist, or a person paused on the bank, deciding whether to cross. Seattle wakes under low clouds the color of wet newsprint, and the city's soundtrack, gull cries, ferry horns, tires slurring through puddles, folds around the offices of Cascadia Horizon. The company sells itself as a beacon of urban renewal, converting derelict warehouses into net-zero lofts. On the top floor, Chief Operations Officer Mara Kincaid stands before wall-to-ceiling windows, coffee cooling in her hand, imagining headlines that praise her latest project. Few suspect the numbers behind those headlines are dissolving like ink in rain. Mara is 40, whip-smart, and disciplined the way climbers are disciplined. Every motion calculated to conserve energy until the summit. She grew up in a Port Angeles trailer, memorizing utility shutoff dates, promising herself she would one day write checks, not bounce them. At Cascadia she finally commands checks big enough to tilt a balance sheet. When city grants and federal green energy subsidies pour in, she supervises disbursement with a smile so reassuring auditors forget to ask follow-up questions. The first deviation begins as a favor. A subcontractor, Suncrest Plumbing, pleads cash flow problems halfway through a retrofit. Mara arranges an advance, $50,000 redirected from another site, then quietly invoices the grant fund twice for the same fixtures list. No alarms ring. The municipal portal tallies expenses in broad categories where copper pipes and marketing brochures occupy the same line. Her screen displays accepted. She exhales, surprised by the ease. Storms, literal and financial, gather that winter. Supply chains stretch, timber costs soar. Mara learns to glide money between projects like a shell game operator, keeping construction crews paid and city inspectors pacified. She builds a spreadsheet coded in pastels, blues for incoming grants, greens for vendor payouts, soft red for gaps. Whenever red blooms, she submits a variance request citing unforeseen mold remediation, always attaching a photo, stock image, tweaked for contrast, of rotted joists. Grants are approved in under 2 weeks. The city prefers progress to paperwork. Her confidant is Bryce Howell, Cascadia's earnest founder whose talent for TED-style optimism outpaces his fluency in cash flow. Bryce trusts Mara's monthly slide decks. Occupancy rising, carbon output falling, community partners engaged. He repeats the talking points on podcasts, and investors nod as though hearing scripture. Mara watches him from the studio wings, a faint ache fluttering in her ribs, part affection, part envy, part dread. The unraveling starts with a blocked sewer line on the Westlake site. City engineer Delia Torres reviews Suncrest Plumbing's work order and notices the fixture's code doesn't match building plans. Curiosity drives her into the grant database, where she finds duplicate invoices stamped paid. She prints them, staring at the identical amounts down to the penny. Outside, rain beats against the municipal window like fingertips insisting on entry. Delia's supervisor tells her not to obsess, administrative hiccup. But Delia has spent 15 years mapping sewer grids. She knows small clogs hint at larger backups. On her own time, she cross-references Cascadia's variances with weather data and permits. One variance cites a flood on a day the National Weather Service recorded clear skies. Another claims asbestos abatement in a warehouse built in 1998, 7 years after asbestos was banned. Delia drafts a memo to the city comptroller, subject line, pattern of irregular disbursements, Cascadia Horizon. While the memo circulates through slow bureaucratic veins, Bryce receives an email from a grant liaison requesting supporting documentation. He forwards it to Mara with a breezy note, "Can you handle?" Mara's pulse ticks faster. She opens the pastel spreadsheet. The red column now totals $4.3 million. Money spent twice, sometimes 3 times, patched with shifting entries that resemble liquidity only from a distance. She tells herself to breathe. She has managed tighter cliffs. That night she drives to Alki Beach, rain needling the windshield, and parks facing a dark Puget Sound. She types a resignation letter on her phone, fingers trembling but cannot press send. Without her, crews will stop, tenants will sue, Bryce will watch his dream implode. She deletes the draft, decides to move more money instead. One final transfer, she thinks, the way gamblers think one final hand will even the odds. The city, however, has initiated a forensic audit. Delia and 2 accountants arrive unannounced, requesting vendor ledgers and bank reconciliations. Mara seats them in a conference room that smells of fresh cedar and fear. She supplies printouts, some real, some redesigned the previous evening, but Delia notices timestamp discrepancies. A ledger allegedly generated in January uses a template version released in March. Mara's throat tightens as Delia quietly circles the footer date with a blue pen. Bryce, summoned from a donor luncheon, reads the preliminary findings. Duplicate billing, misallocated subsidies, suspected personal enrichment. He looks at Mara, confusion curdling into disbelief. She starts to explain, cash flow triage, supply shocks, intention to repay, but the words land like pebbles on sheet metal. Bryce leaves the room, face drained, as if exiting a burning building he hadn't realized was on fire. Federal agents arrive 2 weeks later. Cameras outside capture Mara in a charcoal coat, wrists cuffed yet posture straight, rain matting her hair against cheeks she refuses to wipe. The indictment lists wire fraud, grant fraud, and making false statements. Maximum 20 years. Reporters ask why a champion of green housing would cook the books. She answers only once: deadlines don't wait for perfect funding. It is both confession and self-justification, as hollow as the unfinished lofts her schemes propped up. Bryce salvages Cascadia by selling majority control to a national developer. The new owners finish the projects, but murals celebrating local resilience are painted over in corporate teal. Tenants move in, unaware their bamboo floors and smart thermostats trace back to invoices stamped twice. On evenings when the clouds lift, they can see across Elliott Bay to the courthouse where Mara eventually pleads guilty, accepting 5 years and restitution she may never earn. Seattle's rain keeps falling, impartial and tireless, rinsing glass towers and makeshift tents alike. For Delia Torres, each echoing drop is a reminder that infrastructure, whether pipes or promises, corrodes in silence until someone bothers to trace the leak. For Mara, nights in prison bring the sound of distant gutters, steady as a metronome counting down the seconds to release, when she will step outside and feel water on her face with no ledger left to balance. The morning shift in Wolfsburg began the way it always had. Brake lights flickering outside Gate 17, the smell of roasted barley from a nearby bakery, and rows of workers in navy coveralls filing toward the world's largest automobile plant. On the western edge of the complex rose a building nicknamed the Ivory Tower, a stack of mirrored glass where senior engineers designed software no driver would ever see, but which, by 2007, had become the keystone of Volkswagen's future in America. Volkswagen craved the US market the way a desert craves rain. European diesels were efficient, yes, but American regulators demanded nitrogen oxide emissions so low they seemed almost theoretical. The company's hardware division proposed an expensive urea injection system. Accountants balked. Instead, a handful of programmers in the powertrain electronics group were told to find a clever solution. Germans have a word: Schummel software, cheat software. No one uttered it aloud, but the mandate hung in the air. They built an algorithm hardly bigger than a lullaby. If the steering wheel stayed motionless, the engine ran at a laboratory setting: cool, clean, compliant. If the wheel budged more than a haircut's breadth, the program switched to road mode, granting torque and mileage Americans loved, while puffing out emissions up to 40 times the legal limit. The code carried an innocuous name: acoustic condition, as if it merely dampened cabin noise. Documentation used passive verbs and nested bullet points. Audits ticked the box: functional requirements satisfied. The cheat was elegant, invisible, and, everyone agreed, temporary just until real hardware caught up. Showroom launches followed. In Los Angeles, billboards boasted clean diesel. No compromises. Test drive weekends offered free lattes and branded tote bags. Customers who disliked hybrids found the alternative seductive. Leather seats, German handling, 50 miles per gallon. A New England biology teacher wrote thank you letters to VW, praising sustainable engineering. Behind the scenes, engineers joked about TDI pixie dust, laughter dampened by the fear that someone somewhere might someday test the cars while turning the wheel. That someone appeared in 2013 at West Virginia University, where a modest research grant funded a road emissions study. 2 graduate students attached portable analyzers to a Passat and a Jetta, then drove from San Diego to Seattle. Results veered into science fiction. The cars met federal limits in the lab yet spewed pollutants in real traffic at levels comparable to freight trucks. The students reran calibrations suspecting instrument error. Numbers stayed monstrous. They forwarded findings to the California Air Resources Board, which called a meeting with Volkswagen. Representatives from Wolfsburg arrived in tailored suits, assuring regulators the anomaly was a technical oversight. They promised software updates. Months later, a new round of tests showed marginal improvement, not a cure. Emails pinged across continents. Engineers typed phrases like, impossible to meet targets without risk, then clicked delete but not fast enough. Servers archived everything. September 2015, Frankfurt Auto Show. Amid champagne flutes and concept cars, U.S. officials delivered an ultimatum: confess or face a sales freeze. That Friday, in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the Middle-End Canal, a senior manager sighed and, according to minutes later leaked, muttered, "Let's tell them the truth." By Monday, Volkswagen issued a terse statement acknowledging irregularities affecting 11 million vehicles worldwide. Stock traders reacted first. Shares fell 30% in 2 days. Dealership phones rang off hooks. Bewildered owners asked whether they could legally drive to work. In a Detroit cul-de-sac, a family taped a handwritten sign to their diesel wagon: "Not as green as we hoped." Late-night comedians found punchlines in German precision. But inside Wolfsburg, the mood transcended embarrassment. It was existential dread. Workers feared layoffs, pensioners feared devalued stock, engineers feared prison. Investigations multiplied like cracks in ice. Internal auditors combed Git logs, tracing the cheat's birth to a line of code written 8 years earlier by an employee identified only as Person A. German prosecutors raided homes at dawn, confiscating laptops, notebooks, even post-it notes peeled from monitors. In Washington, congressional hearings featured diesel Jettas hoisted on hydraulic lifts as lawmakers demanded explanations. One committee member held up a child's inhaler, asking why corporate ambition had trumped public lungs. Eventually, the story crystallized. A culture obsessed with market share had cornered itself. Each quarter's presentation touted clean diesel growth, leaving no room for rewind. Engineers who questioned feasibility received curt emails: targets are given, not debated. The defeat device was not a single villain's brainstorm but a collective shrug that settled into routine, ethical fatigue disguised as technical ingenuity. Settlements arrived like winter storms. Volkswagen pled guilty to conspiracy to defraud the United States, agreed to pay more than $20 billion in buybacks and environmental funds, and funded charging stations for the very electric cars it once scorned. In German court, the former CEO claimed ignorance. Judges raised eyebrows at his handwritten notes referencing steering angle criteria. Middle managers served short sentences. A few fled to countries without extradition treaties. The Powertrain Electronics Group was dissolved. Its offices repurposed for battery development teams. Today, visitors to Wolfsburg can tour the Transparency Factory, a glass plant where electric ID models glide along silent tracks. Guides speak of a new chapter. Yet in a quiet corridor, a plaque lists past milestones, among them the year 2015, described only as reorientation. Employees pass quickly, eyes forward. At shift's end they cycle home along the canal, where evening mist mingles with the memory of invisible smoke. The lesson lingers like diesel odor on a cold morning. A deception measured in lines of code can travel continents, pollute skies, and corrode trust far faster than any car can accelerate. And in every ivory tower where targets outpace physics, the Wolfsburg saga whispers a warning. When engineers are told to be clever instead of candid, the exhaust may one day reach the boardroom. Soft morning fog curled over Lake Geneva, wrapping the glass HQ of Helvian Therapeutics in a hush more suited to monasteries than billion-franc science. Inside, Dr. Leonard Leo Berger, Vice President of Clinical Strategy, chronically rumpled, brilliant enough to excuse it, stood at the 12th floor window and watched delivery boats ghost across the water. In 2 hours he would join the executive committee to announce Phase 3 results for HL47, a blue-tinted vial that, if successful, might end a rare childhood seizure disorder and mint fortunes for anyone positioned ahead of the news. Few knew the results yet, fewer still understood how fragile they were. Leo did. The data sat in a password-locked folder named Elias, after the twin brother he'd lost to seizures at age 6. Tonight, if the numbers held, Leo planned to toast the victory with one stiff Calvados and sleep for the first time in weeks. Across town, in a minimalist apartment where everything was gray or stainless steel, Maya Dufour zipped a slim laptop into a violin case whose velvet lining had never touched an instrument. Maya, 35, played multiple roles. Compliance lawyer by resume, information broker by necessity, daughter of a father whose maritime logistics firm owed more than it earned. Through encrypted channels she marketed slivers of future earnings, merger whispers, trial outcomes, to a circle of hedge fund managers who paid in crisp crypto. Her alias among them was Solstice, because she delivered illumination when nights were longest. They had no idea her primary source was a single, careful friendship. Leo and Maya met 2 years earlier at a bioethics panel in Basel. He admired her incisive questions, his stammered honesty. Coffee followed, then hikes in the Vaud Alps, always platonic, threaded with debate about patient access and pharma greed. Leo felt heard, Maya felt trusted. What she did with that trust began as reconnaissance, listen, note, sell, until, to her surprise, she started caring about the scientists behind the data. The last 3 lunches she took nothing, shared nothing. But tonight's impending press release represented the sort of jackpot her clients demanded. Binary, imminent, decisive. Her father's creditors were not known for patience. Maya messaged Leo just after sunrise. Fondue after your big reveal? He replied with a thumbs-up emoji and the word finally. Minutes later, Helvian's head of security, Amjad Rahim, scanned overnight server logs. One line jabbed his gaze. At 2:14 Central European Time someone attempted, but failed, to enter the Elias folder from an external IP registered in Singapore. The system repelled it, but Amjad, ex-Interpol cybercrime, believed failed attempts told richer stories than successful ones. He initiated a quiet trace, meaning no alarms, no emails, just a digital tripwire around every file stamped HL47 confidential. At 9 o'clock the executive committee assembled. Leo presented slides. Seizure frequency down 63%, side effects tolerable, statistical significance beyond doubt. Applause rose, restrained only by Swiss decorum. The CEO scheduled a market-moving press call for Friday 7:30. Until then, the data stayed embargoed. Leo exhaled. Maya received his text, "It's beautiful," while pacing Quai du Mont Blanc. 2 words were enough. She opened an app that erased itself after 30 seconds and typed, "By Helvian. Max size. Can't miss." The recipient, a fund in New York, sent back a purple lightning bolt emoji, contractual code for $250,000 transferred upon confirmation. Yet Amjad's tripwire quivered. At 10:42 someone inside Helvian forwarded a spreadsheet titled budget_projection.xlsx to an external Gmail. The spreadsheet's metadata showed 347 hidden rows, all named with HL47 variables. The sender was Leonard Berger. Amjad frowned. Insiders rarely leak under their own logins. He ducked into a soundproof pod, rang Leo. "Did you just mail trial data out of network?" Leo mid-corridor froze. "What? Of course not." "Then either your account's compromised or you have a ghost at your keyboard. Meet me, server room B, in 5. Panic is a fast professor." Leo replayed yesterday's memories, Maya borrowing his phone at the cafe to check tram times, fingers moving faster than conversation. Him typing the 6-digit passcode in plain sight. He felt the corridor narrow. Server room B smelled of ozone and cold metal. Amjad displayed the email header. Destination address ends adriatique.art. Ring a bell? Leo shook his head. In that moment 2 loyalties dueled inside him. The company protecting children's futures, and a friend he perhaps misread. He opted for truth. "I think I know who." Amjad's posture hardened. Then we both go. Maya sat at a lakeside bench, violin case at her feet, eyes closed to memorize the gull's rhythm. She told herself sounds would anchor her later if guilt rose. Footsteps approached, 2 sets. She opened her eyes to see Leo's disappointment first, security badge second. Leo spoke gently. "Did you use my credentials?" She inhaled. "I copied them. I was desperate. You could have asked for help." "Help doesn't wire by Monday," she whispered. Amjad requested the laptop. Maya handed over the case. Inside, along with the device, sat an unopened envelope addressed Papa. The investigation was swift. Helvian postponed its press call and filed a confidential notice with Swiss authorities. The hedge fund, smelling smoke, unwound the order before execution. No shares changed hands. Maya faced charges of attempted insider dealing and unauthorized access. Because the data never actually left Helvian's firewall, prosecutors offered 18 months plus a steep fine. She accepted. Leo testified, voice cracking only once when asked why he still visited her during pretrial detention. "Because she's the first person who listened when HL-47 was just a sketch," he said. "I owe her that much honesty." The drug received approval a year later, saving children Maya would never meet. Helvian stock soared, not overnight but steadily as trust returned. Leo stopped sitting by the window. He took walks instead, each circuit of the lake reminding him that water, like people, can look clear while hiding tangled currents beneath. In a quiet cell near Lausanne, Maya practiced violin on a silent frame, metal strings over plastic bridge, imagining sounds only she could hear. Outside her window the Alps stood patient, snow-topped and indifferent, teaching that peaks and falls share the same rock, only the angles change. The Rotterdam Port Authority liked to say it could move anything, containers, crude ideas, yet no one imagined how easily it could move thin air. On the top floor of the Harbor View Tower, Annika van Zigel, Director of Sustainability Initiatives, opened her blinds each dawn to watch gantry cranes trace silhouettes against pink North Sea light. She was 37, sharp-voiced, and widely praised for turning the port into Europe's leading market for carbon offset futures. Behind the applause, however, a single spreadsheet waited like a dormant virus. Annika's ascent began the year the EU launched Phase 4 of its emissions trading scheme. Every shipping firm docking in Rotterdam now needed allowances. Those who beat their targets could auction the surplus. The port created Clean Harbor, a digital exchange that matched buyers, sellers, and speculative funds hungry for a green narrative. Daily volume tripled within months, and journalists photographed Annika beside turbine blades, calling her the broker of breathable air. But Clean Harbor's code base held a loophole. If a trade settled cross-jurisdictional, and both counterparties listed the port as a transit registry, the system checked only the net balance, not the underlying serial numbers. A developer flagged the issue in a team chat. Annika, needing the platform live before a climate summit, replied, "We'll patch post-launch, non-critical." A week later, she quietly registered a shell company in Dublin named Zephyr Atlantic Trading. Each Thursday at 18:02, after traders shut their terminals, Annika logged in as Zephyr and executed paired orders. Sell 100,000 credits to a Danish fuel supplier, buy the same amount back milliseconds later via a Maltese broker. To Clean Harbor the maneuver looked balanced. To the broader EU registry, Zephyr's credits duplicated, once in Denmark's ledger, once still under Zephyr's control. She then sold the phantom second copy on an over-the-counter chat to a Polish steel mill willing to pay cash plus 6% facilitation. The mill received legal serials. The duplicates remained invisible like carbon dioxide itself. Annika didn't pocket money directly. Instead, Zephyr's profits funded a venture fund she ran in her brother's name, investing in algae bioreactors, tidal kites, ventures that promised a greener tomorrow. She convinced herself the fraud was pre-monetizing future good. The loop continued for 18 months, printing 1.2 million euros each cycle, always rolled into new eco-startups. Enter Klaus Bittner, a forensic accountant at Europol's Financial Intelligence Unit, tasked with tracking carbon credit carousel frauds that had plagued earlier phases of the ETS. Klaus carried a military posture and a fondness for mint lozenges. Colleagues called him the metronome because he typed at a steady 60 keystrokes a minute, no matter the hour. While mapping credit movements across registries, he noticed Rotterdam's Thursday night spike. Volumes up, prices unmoved, counterparties shuffled like playing cards. One identifier, NLRAX55DZX, appeared both in Danish and Polish ledgers within 24 hours, impossible under EU settlement rules. Klaus requested server logs from Clean Harbor. Anika, alerted by IT, intercepted the email and phoned him, voice warm with cooperative zeal. "Happy to help," she said, suggesting a video call Monday. Over the weekend she deleted Zephyr's trade history beyond the mandatory 2-year window and altered audit hashes to match. She slept only 3 hours, jolting awake whenever ship horns echoed through her apartment overlooking Moss River water black as ink. Monday on the video call, Klaus asked why Clean Harbor's cryptographic signatures restarted every Thursday 1800 hours. Anika blamed a legacy timestamp bug. Klaus nodded, said nothing, ended the call. He then compared Clean Harbor's API pings to backbone internet metadata stored by a Dutch telecommunications tap. At precisely 1802 each Thursday, an encrypted packet flowed from an IP block assigned to Harborview Tower's executive floor. The MAC address resolved to Anika's laptop. Klaus forwarded his findings to the Dutch Fiscal Information and Investigation Service, FIOD. Agents arrived on a drizzly Thursday, 1800 hours sharp. In the glass conference room they asked Anika to execute her routine. Hand trembling, she opened Clean Harbor. The agents mirrored her screen on a projector. She could stall or comply, either choice mapped to exposure. Instead, she closed the laptop, folded her hands and uttered, "The credits were always temporary. Real reductions take investment." To the agents, it sounded less like justification than a weary lament. The subsequent inquiry revealed 19 million counterfeit allowances, enough to offset the annual emissions of Portugal, ghosting across ledgers before evaporating into database purges. The EU suspended Clean Harbor. Rotterdam's mayor called it a breach of planetary trust. Anika pleaded guilty to aggravated forgery and market manipulation, receiving 4 years and an order to forfeit €83 million in venture assets, some of which had already seeded carbon-negative cement now hailed as revolutionary. Startups scrambled, investors sued. In prison workshops smelling of disinfectant and sawdust, Anika drafted policy papers on registry interoperability. She mailed one to Klaus, thanking him for seeing the difference between thin air and empty space. He replied with a single sentence, "Integrity isn't a commodity, but we still have to trade in it." Today the cranes still trace their silhouettes against the North Sea dawn, containers move and carbon markets resume under stricter checksum protocols. Ships dock, pay their dues and sail on. Only in the registry archives, amid scrubbed tables, does the ghost of Zephyr Atlantic linger, an absence shaped exactly like the tons of carbon it never removed from the sky. No one visiting California's Santa Ynez Valley in early spring suspects the dark arithmetic beneath its rolling green rows. The hills smell of wet grass and distant citrus. Barns carry the soft hum of fermenting grapes, and on a secluded rise stands Sol de Verano, the boutique winery that financial magazines once called a masterclass in sustainable luxury. Its glass-walled tasting room reflects the orchard below like a tranquil postcard, but the man who built that reflection, CFO Miles Carew, is watching it shatter. Miles is 46, slender, with silver at his temples and an accent polished by 2 Ivy League degrees. He joined Sol de Verano 5 years ago, hired to shepherd the winery's expansion into craft-branded olive oil and sparkling cider. Investors loved the diversification story. Local papers loved the idea that small-batch agriculture could outshine Silicon Valley yields. What no one outside the finance office knew was how heavily the dream leaned on federal agriculture grants. Dollars that arrived in quarterly bursts, each earmarked for irrigation upgrades, solar panels, or drought-resistant rootstock. The first breach is almost accidental. A $310,000 grant lands for solar optimization, but the installer's quote comes in $42,000 under budget. Miles files the rebate as usual, then hesitates. The winery's bottling line needs repairs and bank credit is tight. He moves the spare $42,000 into an equipment holding account, intending to reimburse the grant once tasting room sales rebound. The act is small, the kind accountants call timing. The equipment is fixed, no red flags rise, and Miles discovers a new flavor of control. Soon the holding account becomes a revolving door. Miles directs the vineyard crew to overstate labor hours on grant applications by 15%, convincing them the cushion will smooth payroll. County inspectors rarely cross-check seasonal time cards. Each approved grant now produces breathing room. 80,000 here, 120,000 there. Sums Miles shifts into operating cash, then outward again to cover shipping surcharges, boutique marketing, eventually even a sleek Tesla Model S that arrives in midnight blue. His wife Claudia admires the car's silent glide. Miles tells her a venture capital firm granted him performance options. She nods, half listening, already planning a weekend in Big Sur. The winery's founders, vintner couple Lena and Rafael Ochoa, focus on vines and Michelin star restaurant deals, leaving ledgers to Miles. They relish his calm dashboards, colored bars rising, debt ratios falling. Wine critics parade through polished halls and write phrases like, "a beacon for regenerative agriculture." During tours, Miles pours a 2015 Cabernet and speaks of carbon sequestration, knowing the solar array that should power the estate exists only on architectural renderings. Then drought tightens. Wells recede, water trucks command triple rates. Grants slow as Congress wrangles budgets. Miles's juggling requires faster cycles. He submits a request for $2.4 million to plant experimental olive groves, attaching drone photos of neighboring orchards cropped to hide the Sol de Verano logo. Approval, he calculates, will plug every hole. But the dossier lands on the desk of Amy Delgado, a newly hired analyst at the USDA's regional office. Amy is 28, raised on a Modesto almond farm, and suspicious of immaculate narratives. She zooms into the drone images and notices varietal spacing inconsistent with olive cultivation. Instead, the rows look like wine grapes trained on trellises. She drives 3 hours to Santa Ynez on an unannounced Monday, gravel crunching beneath government plates as she parks by the rose-framed gate. Miles greets her with practiced warmth. They tour barrel rooms scented with French oak. He speaks of drought resilience. Amy listens, counts irrigation valves, notes that no olive saplings peak between rows. Back in her Sacramento cubicle, she overlays Sol de Verano's grant map with satellite NDVI vegetation indices. The pixel shades tell a different story. No new orchards, no new solar panels, only the same neat rectangles of Cabernet and Syrah. She files a request for documentary support. Miles receives the email at dusk, vineyard lights flickering on like nervous fireflies. Panic presses close. He considers fabricating purchase orders, but Amy's tone suggests she will not be deceived by paperwork alone. Instead, he schedules a call with Lena and Rafael, framing Amy's questions as routine due diligence that demands quick responses. The vintners, trusting, approve whatever he needs. Miles spends 2 nights forging invoices, panel serial numbers, seedling receipts, a fictitious contractor in Fresno. He misses Claudia's birthday dinner, claiming urgent export paperwork. She stares at the empty candle stub on the cake, wondering when success began sounding like absence. Amy receives the files, cross-references tax IDs, and discovers the contractor dissolved 3 years ago. She forwards her findings to the USDA's Office of Inspector General. Within weeks, agents arrive with badge lanyards and a sealed warrant. They photograph empty rooftops where solar panels should glint, test soil for olive DNA and find none, trace fund transfers from the holding account to a Tesla dealership in Santa Barbara. Interrogation unfolds in a windowless utility room that once stored oak barrels. Miles sits opposite 2 agents whose notepads remain closed. They already have what they need. He confesses in a steady voice as though reading a tasting note. Hints of entitlement, notes of rationalization, a lingering finish of regret. The scheme totals $8.7 million across 4 fiscal years. Money siphoned in increments too small to startle, too frequent to stop. Court proceedings draw reporters who photograph rolling hills under headlines like Green Dreams, Red Ink. Lena and Rafael fight foreclosure. The tasting room empties. Distributors switch labels overnight. Miles pleads guilty to wire fraud and grand embezzlement, earning 5 years in Lompoc Federal Correctional and lifetime debarment from federal programs. Claudia files for divorce, citing irreconcilable distances measured not in miles but in missing dinners. On warm afternoons, tourists still drift past Santa Ynez vineyards, unaware of the shuttered glass room atop the hill. Wild mustard reclaims the unplanted acres where olives never grew. When the wind blows just right, the Tesla's charging cable slaps the garage wall. an idle metronome counting out the silence left behind when numbers, like vines, are stretched beyond what the soil can bear. Winter dusk settled over Manhattan like charcoal dust, turning the glass facade of the Whitmore Museum Trust into a mirror of blurred taxi lights. Inside the penthouse office, Noah Berkeley, chief financial officer, wearer of discreet cufflinks and inheritor of an Ivy League baritone, leaned over a stack of shipping invoices for the museum's traveling exhibition. Beneath the crisp printouts lay his real concern, a spreadsheet titled Goya Fund, innocuous name for a $28 million hole he had spent 3 years widening, sell by careful sell. Noah's public self stood on podiums praising Art for All initiatives, but his private ledger told a different story. After his wife's medical bills ballooned and his condo renovation doubled in cost, he discovered the peculiar liquidity of deaccession reserves. Money set aside when museums temporarily loan masterpieces to private collectors. The board rarely inspected the fund. Curators cared only that paintings returned unharmed. One April afternoon, Noah moved $140,000 from the reserve into a side account labeled Courier Insurance. 2 weeks later, he shifted the same amount to a shell LLC called Faraday Logistics, then wired it onward to pay contractors smoothing Venetian plaster in his living room hallway. Nothing cracked, alarms stayed mute. By the second summer, he upgraded the con. Each time a Titian or a Mondrian left the building, Noah inflated the climate-controlled transport cost by 11%, depositing the excess into Faraday. The museum's head registrar, Claire Dubas, signed the paperwork without hesitation. She trusted Noah's encyclopedic recall of customs tariffs. He can quote freight rates like curators quote provenance, she joked. Noah offered a shy smile, grateful she mistook obsession for expertise. The scheme might have glided indefinitely if not for Gemma Rivas, a newly arrived auditor from Barcelona tasked with implementing a EU-compliant art loan protocol. Gemma's first week unfolded in polite tedium until she noticed that every Faraday invoice ended in sequential prime numbers, 103, 107, 109, as if pattern were a private wink. Curious, she searched Faraday's corporate registry and found a single physical address, a UPS store in Queens. Gemma requested historical ledgers from Noah's office. He obliged, jovial, though his pulse hitched when he spotted the audit date range, 5 fiscal years, reaching back to the first quiet transfer. That night he rode the elevator alone, city lights flickering like distant errors. In his briefcase sat a flash drive containing 2 sets of books, official and adjusted. He considered replacing the originals, then pictured security cameras tracking every keystroke. Instead, he drafted an email to Gemma attributing dollar fluctuations to fuel surcharge arithmetic, attaching a PDF dense with airline kerosene charts. Gemma studied the graphs, frowning. The surcharges spiked on dates no major carrier logged fuel hikes. She dug deeper, cross-matching artwork transit dates with NOAA weather logs. One Picasso had supposedly required a heated truck across Arizona in July, another a de-icing unit in Miami. Discrepancies multiplied like reflections in a mirrored gallery. Meanwhile, Noah's world tightened. His wife, Marianne, admired their finished condo but wondered why the marble floors left him restless at night. She found him in the kitchen at 3 a.m., scrolling transfer receipts. He murmured that interest rates were misbehaving. She believed him. After all, numbers were Noah's native tongue. The unraveling began on a drizzly Thursday. Gemma summoned Noah and Claire to a small conference room overlooking the Hudson. She laid 3 documents on the table: Faraday's registry file, courier invoices with identical time stamps, and NOAA weather screenshots. Her voice remained soft. "Mr. Berkeley, can you help reconcile these?" Claire's eyes darted from the papers to Noah. He opened his mouth, first to deny, then to deflect, but the data allowed no foothold. There were budget reallocations, he said, hearing his own diction thin. The window behind him reflected storm clouds stacking like overdue bills. Gemma forwarded her findings to the museum's general counsel. By Monday, the Manhattan District Attorney's Major Economic Crimes Unit peppered the finance floor with polite but inevitable questions. Agents discovered that Faraday's bank account funneled $9.7 million to luxury contractors, tuition payments, and a Bahamian brokerage labeled medical contingency. News broke. Whitmore's CFO under investigation for art loan fraud. Donors withdrew pledges, fearing scandal might cling to their names like varnish fumes. Claire avoided eye contact with docents who whispered about betrayal among the brushstrokes. Noah surrendered quietly. His mugshot captured an expression more exhausted than defiant, as if calculation itself had betrayed him. He pled guilty to wire fraud and money laundering, accepting a 7-year sentence and restitution that would liquidate the condo whose walls gleamed with unblemished Venetian plaster. Marianne sold the apartment, donated her remaining proceeds to an artist's healthcare charity, and moved uptown to a smaller rental where late-night silence felt mercifully honest. Gemma stayed on to help rebuild controls. Dual signature disbursements, third-party freight validation, surprise audits. She sometimes paused before the Goya that had inspired the fraudulent fund's name, noting how the painting's shadowed figures still held poise despite centuries of chaos around them. Today, visitors line the museum's marble atrium, unaware that a ledger once ran under their feet like a hidden fault line. They lift phones toward canvases, chasing angles of light that hide nothing. In a federal prison library across the river, Noah volunteers to catalog donated art books. He handles each volume gently, tracing images of masterpieces he once moved only as numbers. Outside, the Hudson keeps its slow tidal rhythm. Forward, back, forward, testing the shoreline but never erasing it, the same way memory tugs at a conscience that finally ran out of room to shift the figures around. Early evenings in Shrewsford, a medieval market town on England's south coast, belong to the cathedral chimes. Stone streets glow amber under gas-style lamps, and the ancient clock tower marks each quarter hour with a sound locals trust more than any forecast. At the borough offices on Abbey Lane, Chief Finance Officer Gareth Loden once treated those bells as metronomes for his spreadsheets. Steady, impartial, eternal. Then came the bonds and the bells began to feel accusatory. Gareth was 44, tidy beard, reputation for prizing caution over glamour. His proudest purchase was a vintage fountain pen, not a fast car. When the government loosened borrowing rules for councils to unlock regional growth, Gareth saw an opportunity to lift Shrewsford out of budget austerity. He proposed issuing £110 million in municipal revenue bonds to build a business park on derelict marshland, a plan packaged in slides colored like sunrise. Job creation, green roofs, heritage footpaths. Councillors, dazzled by phrases such as self-financing and whole-life carbon savings, voted yes in 40 minutes. The first tranche sold easily to pension funds. Construction, however, stumbled. Environmental surveys found a protected mute habitat. Permits stalled. Interest on the unused capital began to accrue faster than Gareth's timetables allowed. Restless, he accepted a lunch invitation from Columbine Capital, a boutique advisory firm housed in a glass cube outside London Bridge. Over sea base and chilled Viognier, their director spoke of structured yield swaps, vehicles that could monetize the dormant bond cash until shovels finally hit soil. Gareth, hungry for a solution, nodded along. Columbine's product was seductively simple on paper. Park £60 million in a Cayman-based note paying 8%, collateralized by North Sea Energy royalties. Gareth read the glossy term sheet 3 times, pausing at a footnote granting Columbine discretion to optimize suballocations. He convinced himself the clause was harmless, annealed every page, and transferred the funds on a damp Thursday when fog erased the harbor horizon. 4 2/4 yields flowed like clockwork. Gareth updated councillors with confident bar graphs, citing active treasury stewardship. The budget committee applauded. Local papers reported that Shrewsford might avoid raising council tax for the first time in a decade. Gareth walked home beneath the clock tower, hearing the bells as personal applause. Then energy prices collapsed after an unseasonably warm winter. Columbine emailed a terse market volatility update, advising temporary suspension of distributions. Gareth's inbox filled with vendor invoices and loan interest reminders. He logged into the Cayman portal and saw the fund's value marked down 27%. Panic flickered, then hardened into calculation. He reclassified the investment on the council balance sheet as strategic infrastructure prepayment, a category exempt from mark-to-market rules under a little-used accounting note. The loss vanished, at least officially. He told himself it was temporary camouflage. But bond rating analysts scheduled a routine review. To protect the illusion, Gareth prepared a valuation letter purportedly from a Big Four accountancy. attaching a forged PDF he built in his study while the cathedral bells announced midnight. The letter affirmed the fund's value at par. He uploaded it to the rating portal and exhaled as the agency reaffirmed Shrewsford's AA rating, oblivious to the counterfeit. Enter Amelia Hart, a spring-heeled graduate auditor seconded from the National Audit Office. Tasked with sampling council investments for compliance, she noticed that Shrewsford's prepayment line item bore the identical figure, to the penny, across 3 consecutive quarters, unlikely for any offshore note. She rang Gareth for clarifications. He spoke warm, rushed, promised an updated appraisal once the partner signs off. Amelia, unconvinced, emailed Columbine directly. Their out-of-office auto-reply listed a phone number routed, oddly, to Luxembourg. That weekend Amelia drove down, mixing work with a seaside stroll. She poked around company's house filings and discovered Columbine's directors had resigned en masse 2 months earlier, replaced by nominees linked to energy royalty schemes under investigation in Norway. The pattern smelled of carousel finance, not community uplift. Monday, she submitted a confidential alert to the Public Sector Fraud Authority. Investigators discreetly subpoenaed Shrewsford's treasury emails and uncovered metadata showing Gareth had created the Big 4.pdf on his personal laptop 1 hour before upload. They also traced £2 million in advisory rebates, wired from Columbine to a Gibraltar account whose sole signatory was G. Loden. On a rainy April morning, as gulls wheeled above the tidal flats, officers from the City of London Police escorted Gareth from the borough offices. Staff watched, stunned, while the clock tower told 10. In interviews he claimed he'd feared budget calamity, that the rebates were success fees to offset losses, that everything would have balanced out if energy prices had turned. His words landed flat as damp ledger paper. The trial drew modest national coverage under the headline, Council CFO Forged Audit to Hide £28 million Loss. Prosecutors detailed how the Cayman note was never backed by royalties but by speculative shale leases in the American Midwest, already in default. Gareth pleaded guilty to fraud by abuse of position, receiving 5 years and a lifetime ban from public office. The council, forced to raise taxes after all, mothballed the business park scheme and laid off 40 staff. Months later, scaffolding encases the clock tower for overdue stonework, funded, ironically, by a heritage grant Gareth once bypassed as too small to matter. Each chime now echoes across a town wrestling with skepticism. Can numbers be trusted if even bells, once symbols of certainty, proved incapable of warning that time itself was being stolen, quarter hour by quarter hour, from everyone who believed the books were true? Mansfield, Ohio, 2009. A town of quiet porches and clipped lawns where gossip traveled faster than the mail truck. At the center of Main Street stood People's Heritage Bank, a modest, red brick institution that prided itself on handshake etiquette and paper passbooks. Its branch manager, Eleanor Ellie Cartwright, had been a reassuring figure for almost 20 years, steel gray bob, pressed blouses, a habit of calling every customer by name. She coordinated bake sale donations, chaired the Rotary Scholarship Committee, and played hymns on Sundays at St. Paul's. No one suspected she was rewriting the books beneath her gentle smile. Ellie's scheme began the way most do, a tiny, almost invisible adjustment. A frail aunt needed surgery. Ellie advanced $2,000 from a dormant account, promising herself she would pay it back with her Christmas bonus. She did, yet the rush of control lingered, like a muted chord in a hymn that refuses to resolve. Soon the temporary loans grew bolder. Each was concealed inside the monthly reconciliation process she alone performed after closing hours. The bank's software printed a neat daily report. Ellie generated a second, doctored version, then slid it into the leather binder signed by the board. The simplicity of the process amazed her. Columns of numbers looked intimidating to outsiders, but to Ellie they sang. She discovered that if she transferred funds before 3 p.m. and reversed the entry before 10 a.m. next day, interest calculations aligned perfectly, as though nothing ever moved. It became a private waltz: debit, credit, erase, exhale. She bought her aunt a condominium, paid college tuition for 2 nieces, and quietly upgraded her own life: cashmere instead of cotton, an Audi leased under her brother-in-law's name. Mansfield noticed the sheen, yet attributed it to years of frugal saving. After all, Ellie had no children, no extravagant vacations, no visible vices. But trust phrase from the edges. A junior auditor, Mark Delaney, arrived from Columbus one September to perform a routine review. He was 26, still carried textbooks in his briefcase, and believed spreadsheets could reveal character the way fingerprints reveal identity. On his third evening, he stayed past closing to verify dormant accounts. That was when he found the first mismatch. Account 1425-19 belonging to a deceased mill worker showed a balance of $12,814 on the system, but the printed ledger Ellie had filed in the binder listed $32,814. Only 2 digits apart, easy to miss, yet for Mark it flashed like a strobe. He returned next morning, requested supporting documents, and noticed Ellie's hand tremble as she passed him the file. She recovered instantly, offering coffee, peppermint creamer, a warm anecdote about his hometown. Mark smiled, but the numbers had lodged in his mind. By noon he built a pivot table comparing electronic records against Ellie's bound ledgers. 5 discrepancies surfaced, then 11, forming a quiet constellation of absence worth $1.9 million. Mark did not confront her. Instead, he followed protocol. He called the bank's regional compliance officer in Cleveland, secured permission to install a shadow copy of the server, and waited. Over the next week, Ellie performed her nightly dance, unaware her steps were mirrored in real time. Each reversal sang on Mark's screen like a note out of key. He printed the evidence, sealing it in a manila envelope. On Friday evening, a rainstorm flooded Main Street gutters. Ellie, alone in her office, finalized another transfer, $48,000, diverted to an escrow account she controlled for facility renovations. She toggled windows, pressed print, and heard the copier hum. When she turned, Mark and 2 federal agents stood in the doorway, rainwater dripping from their trench coats. The interrogation unfolded in the break room. Ellie offered a full confession within an hour, voice hushed, as though explaining a bookkeeping error that inconvenienced no one. She cataloged every withdrawal, every beneficiary, even the date she first felt invincible. March 3, 2003, when the dormant account of a lumberyard closed at 0.00. And no one noticed. The agents listened without interruption. When she finished, Ellie folded her hands and asked if she might play Sunday's Hymn one last time. Mansfield reacted with disbelief that curdled into anger. Parishioners whispered during the offertory. The Rotary Club removed her photo from the newsletter. Yet amid the outrage, a quieter sorrow emerged. People realized how effortlessly a trusted face could mask an abyss. In court, Ellie's attorney painted her as a caregiver ensnared by circumstance. The prosecutor countered with a slideshow of wire transfers and luxury receipts. A mountain chalet in Aspen, a first-class cruise, designer handbags hidden in her cousin's attic. The jury deliberated less than 4 hours. Judge Ramirez, who had shaken Ellie's hand at every Christmas party, delivered the sentence, 8 years in federal prison, restitution of $2.3 million, lifetime prohibition from banking. During sentencing, Ellie never wept. She stared at the courtroom clock, perhaps noting how minutes, like dollars, can be borrowed but must eventually be returned. Outside, winter had already brushed the maple leaves with bronze. Mark Delaney exited through the side door, clutching his overcoat against the chill. He felt no triumph, only the dull weight of knowledge. Every ledger, no matter how neatly kept, can whisper secrets if someone cares to listen. That night, Mansfield streetlights flickered under early snow. Families locked their doors, reassured children that monsters were imaginary. Few understood that the scariest monsters were cardigans, remember birthdays, and know precisely when to reverse a journal entry. Paris, 2008. At dawn, the glass towers of La Défense caught the first rose-colored light, mirroring a city still yawning awake. Inside the trading floor of Banque d'Europe, computer screens already hummed, rows of LEDs blinking like restless fireflies. The floor's unofficial prince, 31-year-old Julien Moreau, arrived in silence and set down a single espresso on his pristine desk. To his colleagues he seemed almost monastic. No cufflinks, no bravado, only a faint half-smile that suggested he knew something the rest did not. Julian's job was to hedge corporate clients against minor market swings. A conservative mandate, safe as limestone. Yet numbers to him felt less like boundaries and more like brushstrokes. He discovered that if he entered a hedge twice, then canceled one side after the nightly systems sync, the position still looked balanced to compliance. A digital phantom, there in the daylight, gone by midnight, leaving its mirror image hidden in a folder of unauthorized risk. At first the phantom trades were modest, the size of a bakery's weekly flour order. €1,000 became 10, then 100. Each time the market drifted in his favor, he reversed the position, pocketing a slender profit for the bank and a glowing note from his supervisor. Success came wrapped in applause, and applause became permission. Julian no longer waited for market drift, he conjured it. He bought German index futures for Friday close, sold them Monday dawn, and erased the sale from the official ledger. Overnight profits stacked like neat macarons, small, colorful, deceptively weightless. When risk officers glanced over the books, everything reconciled. They praised Julian's discipline, called him the guardian angel of hedging, and granted him wider limits. Parisian evenings grew opulent. Julian, who once rented a studio the size of a train compartment, moved into a loft overlooking the Seine. He still rode the subway, still carried a frayed canvas backpack, but after dark he hosted quiet gatherings where jazz records crackled, and vintage Burgundy flowed like confession. Friends called him modest, rivals called him lucky. No one called him dangerous. Inside his code-littered spreadsheets, however, danger accumulated quietly. By spring, the hidden exposure reached €5 billion, larger than the bank's annual profit, larger than some countries' GDP. Julian told himself he could unwind it in a week if sentiment soured. He built elaborate mental scenarios, escape hatches disguised as strategy updates. All he needed was time, and time still obeyed him. Then came January 21, 2008, Blue Monday, the worst market slide since 9/11. Asian indices opened in free fall, panic ricocheted through Europe before breakfast, and New York had not even sounded its opening bell. Julian sat motionless, eyes tracking futures plunging like stones through water. His phantom book, leveraged dozens of times, bled crimson across 6 monitors. He tried to reverse positions, but liquidity evaporated. Bids vanished the instant he clicked. By noon, paper losses neared $2 billion. He whispered a single phrase, pas encore, not yet, and kept trading. Risk control finally noticed the anomaly at 3 p.m. A line of code refused to reconcile, and the system kicked out an alert shaped like a siren. Compliance officers walked briskly to Julian's desk, as though approaching a wild animal. They asked routine questions. Could you open yesterday's blotter? Could you explain this variance? Their voices steady, eyes already reading catastrophe in the glare of his screens. Julian answered calmly, then rose, removed his security badge and placed it on the desk. The trading floor fell silent except for the relentless tick of the market data feed. That evening, Banque de Europe's CEO interrupted primetime news to announce a trading irregularity that would cost the bank $4.9 billion. Viewers at brasseries across France stared up at televisions, pints paused midair. The CEO spoke of a lone employee, elaborate fraud, inadequate controls. Julian's name was not yet public, but insiders exchanged texts at lightning speed, and by dawn newspapers plastered his photo. A mild face, more teacher than gambler, beneath headlines screaming "Elite Trader Fantany." Investigators descended like winter fog. They scoured logins, emails, badge swipes, CCTV footage, and found nothing but meticulous intent. Julian had spoofed counterparties, recycled transaction numbers, memorized control room lunch schedules. One detective whispered that he treated the bank's architecture the way an organist treats pipes. Every valve, every register perfectly at his fingertips. During interrogation at La Brigade Financière, Julian neither denied nor dramatized. He described his method the way a craftsman describes dovetail joints, precise, almost affectionate. He emphasized he had not stolen a cent for personal gain. Every euro of paper profit belonged to the bank. "I wanted to prove," he said softly, "that the system sees what it expects, not what is real." The officers, expecting greed, met philosophy instead and found it unsettling. The trial lasted 3 humid weeks the following summer. Prosecutors portrayed Julian as a puppet master of algorithms. Defense counsel painted him as a scapegoat for managerial negligence. Spectators queued before dawn for seats, fanning themselves with court summons. Each afternoon, outside the Palais de Justice, television vans sprouted satellite dishes like metal flowers, grasping for signal. Inside, Julian sat unflinching, suit slightly too large as if borrowed. On the final day, he addressed the court in measured French. He spoke of ambition as an echo chamber, of dashboards that reward audacity, of the seductive idea that the smartest person in the room need not ask permission. His voice never rose. When he finished, the marble hall felt colder. The judge pronounced 5 years imprisonment, plus a lifetime trading ban. Gasps rustled like turning pages. The sentence was both severe and symbolic, a caution not merely to one trader but to an industry that permits miracles before it questions them. Handcuffed, Julian glanced at the skylight, gray Parisian dawn settling into the rafters, then disappeared through a side door guarded by 2 gendarmes. In the years that followed, bankers installed new firewalls, doubled compliance staffs, hosted seminars titled Culture and Control. Yet in quieter corners, traders still swapped myths. They whispered that Julian's phantom book, liquidated in haste, would have broken even had the bank waited 48 hours. They debated whether genius and recklessness are twins or strangers. Along the Seine, tour boats glide each night past the softly lit towers of La Défense. Guides speak of art and architecture, never of the invisible fortunes once wagered above those streets. But sometimes, when river mist curls around the pylons, an echo seems to rise from the dark water. The faint, persistent hum of phantom trades, still seeking a ledger that will finally notice them. San Jose, California, 2016. Dawn broke over Highway 101 in hazy gold, and the glass atrium of Nexus Drive Labs shimmered like a prism suspended above the bustle of commuter traffic. Inside the headquarters, the hum of climate-controlled servers mingled with the scent of dark roast coffee. The company, famed for its breakthrough solid-state batteries, was weeks from an IPO projected to crown it the next $20 billion unicorn. At the center of that promise stood Victor Hahn, the 39-year-old vice president of engineering whose coded algorithms optimized heat dissipation down to a single pixel-wide trace on each cell. Victor cultivated deliberate ordinariness. Khaki chinos, faded hoodies, a Civic hybrid he refused to trade for a Tesla. He once explained his philosophy to an intern: invisibility is the engineer's superpower. Flashy things create noise in the data. Yet beneath his measured exterior simmered an old frustration. He had joined Nexus Drive as employee number 11, but newer executives now eclipsed his equity, his influence, even his seat at board meetings. Ambition, like static, built slowly in the background. The opening act began with a recruitment email from a rival firm based in Shenzhen, signed only Echelon V. The message congratulated Victor on a recent patent filing, then hinted that his compensation lagged the market by a factor of 4. Attached was a contract, $8 million in stock, a Shanghai apartment, and director-level autonomy, if he could provide pre-manufactured schematics for Nexus Drive's Generation 4 battery. Victor closed the laptop, heartbeat steady, yet the figures lingered like after-images behind his eyes. Over the next month, he tested the perimeter. He slipped a flash drive into his workstation after midnight, downloaded thermal runaway simulations, then deleted logs via an obscure Linux command few administrators recognized. The files traveled through an encrypted tunnel to a cloud folder he named Gardenias, a private joke. Gardenias were his late mother's favorite flower, blooming sweet and white while hiding toxic sap. Victor told himself it was only leverage. If Nexus Drive's board granted him the CTO role, he would delete the folder and stay loyal. But negotiations stalled. The CEO, bright-eyed and media-savvy, offered a modest stock refresh and a larger team instead of the title. Victor smiled, shook hands, and returned to his lab. That night he exfiltrated the full architecture for Gen 4's proprietary anode, the crown jewel. He crossed the Rubicon in a click barely louder than a breath. Trust began to fray in April when Marta Ruiz, head of information security, conducted routine checksum audits. A single checksum, linked to a subfolder titled heatmaps_v2, showed a timestamp mismatch as though someone had edited, then rewrote the file to mask edits. Marta, a former NSA analyst, felt a chill of pattern recognition. Tampered logs almost always echoed insider sabotage. She launched a silent probe, installing keystroke triggers across top-level engineer accounts, Victor's included. She said nothing to HR, nothing to the C-suite. Secrecy, she believed, was a microscope. Observation altered behavior. For 2 weeks, the triggers captured nothing but long strings of code, Slack banter, and the occasional YouTube link. Then, at 1:17 a.m. on a Wednesday, Victor's credentials accessed the secure repository, compressed 214 megabytes into a password-protected zip, and erased the shell history. Marta traced the outbound IP, a leased server in Singapore popular among gray market brokers. The evidence glowed bright, but she needed one more verification, a live catch, before involving federal agents who might leak and tank the IPO. Marta enlisted Nexus Drive's facilities chief to deactivate Victor's keycard for maintenance testing, forcing him to badge in at the security desk if he returned after hours. The bait was set. Friday evening, employees trickled out for craft beer happy hours while Victor lingered, staring at unit test regressions that no longer held his focus. Near midnight he descended to the lobby. The turnstile rejected his card with a hollow beep. He hesitated, then signed the late entry ledger. Cameras recorded the slight tremor in his pen stroke. Upstairs, Marta monitored from an unlit office, headphones catching the soft clack of Victor's keyboard as he typed a new command. SCP Gen 4_design_final.zip K0 at 204.13.77.9/TMP/X. She hit record on a separate screen, time-stamped the transfer, and dialed her off-book contact at the FBI's San Francisco Cyber Unit. Agents were already parked in an unmarked van 3 blocks away. They entered quietly, blue windbreakers turned inside out, and rode the elevator without lights. When they appeared in the threshold of Victor's lab, he removed his earbuds with slow resignation. There was no Hollywood sprint toward a back door, no plea. He simply closed the terminal, folded his hands, and asked whether the company's stock options would still vest if he cooperated. The lead agent replied that such matters were now above everyone's pay grade. News of the breach detonated across tech media the next morning. Nexus Drive postponed its IPO, shares frozen in the private market clearinghouse. Analysts speculated the entire battery roadmap was compromised. The CEO issued a video statement framed by company logo moss walls, his voice measured yet cracking at the edges. An internal memo revealed that venture fund Omega had pulled its final tranche, citing opacity of trade secret controls. Hundreds of employees refreshed inboxes, fearing layoffs. Victor pled guilty to 1 count of economic espionage under 18 U.S.C. Section 1831. In court, prosecutors painted him as a calculating saboteur. Defense counsel argued underappreciation and burnout. The judge, herself a former software patent litigator, spoke of the fragile membrane between innovation and theft. She delivered a sentence of 46 months in federal prison, plus $11.2 million in restitution, a figure equal to Victor's unvested shares. During transport to Lompoc Penitentiary, Victor gazed through a narrow bus window at the Santa Cruz Mountains, their outlines soft in morning fog. He wondered which lines of code, which minute decisions, had carried him from employee number 11 optimism to chain-linked regret. In Silicon Valley, after all, failure is lionized, except when it is criminal. Nexus Drive eventually re-engineered the Gen 4 platform, delayed 18 months, missing the market window that once felt inevitable. Competitors advanced, investors moved on to hydrogen hype. At twilight, the campus still glows with LED promise, but employees leaving late sometimes pause in the corridor outside Victor's former lab. They speak in low tones about lines of code that were here, then gone, about ambition that hums beneath the quiet until the quiet is gone too. And when the hum ceases, what remains is the silence of missing lines. A vacancy no patch can quite fill, a reminder that in an economy built on invisible ideas, betrayal can be as small and as lethal as the click of a single key. Munich, 2019. Early summer sunlight poured over Maximilianstrasse, painting the stone facades of luxury boutiques in soft gold. A short drive away in the suburb of Askiem stood the glass cube of WireReach AG, Germany's fastest-rising fintech darling. Journalists hailed it as Europe's PayPal, politicians praised its promise of cashless efficiency. At the center of this marvel worked Felix Berner, 42, Chief Accounting Officer, whose neat wire-rimmed spectacles and measured baritone reassured investors on every earnings call. Felix had joined WireReach a decade earlier, when the firm was little more than rented server racks and a handful of engineers processing obscure online gaming payments. Back then his job involved reconciling microtransactions and arguing with auditors over rounding errors. But as revenue ballooned from tens of millions to billions, he discovered a second vocation: defending the company's myth. The CEO, charismatic and restless, preached a vision of borderless money. Felix made the numbers match the sermon, even when reality strayed. The balancing act began innocently enough. A partner in Singapore delayed remitting settlement fees. To avoid a revenue dip, Felix booked the cash as in transit, a line item no one questioned. The following quarter, a client in Dubai fell behind. He repeated the trick, comforted by the belief that funds would arrive eventually. They did not, yet the prop remained on stage, invisible to all but him. What started as patches evolved into architecture. Felix created 3 acquiring subsidiaries, 2 in Manila, 1 in Hong Kong, tasked on paper with processing payments for difficult markets. In practice, they existed only as letterheads and rented desks. Through them he routed phantom profits, complete with forged merchant contracts and circular bank confirmations. He learned the auditor's rhythms: request, delay, partial proof, senior partner luncheon, sign off. Each year the missing cash swelled. By 2019 the balance, labeled third-party acquirer trust accounts, reached 1.9 billion euros, sitting, so the spreadsheets claimed, in 2 Philippine banks few Europeans could pronounce. Munich's financial press adored WireReach's meteoric growth, yet a slender thread of skepticism ran through the London bureau of the Financial Clarion. An investigative reporter named Cara Doyle had spent months querying WireReach's opaque Asia revenues. She traveled to Manila, knocked on the door of one subsidiary's listed address, and found a shuttered storefront selling karaoke machines. Back in London she published a 12-page expose titled, "The Billion Euro Mirage." WireReach's share price dipped, then bounced as analysts defended the firm. Felix read the article at his kitchen table, pulse steady, and sent a calm memo to investors: all funds verified by international auditors. But trust frays on repetition. The German regulator BaFin, long deferential, received a whistleblower email alleging forged bank statements. The writer was no crusader, just a junior treasury clerk alarmed by an instruction to clean fonts on a PDF before forwarding it to KPMG. BaFin, sensitive after past scandals, appointed special investigators. Felix welcomed them with blueberry muffins in the conference room, projected PowerPoints of complex flows, and spoke of regulatory arbitrage and emerging markets. Still, the investigators demanded direct confirmation from the Philippine banks. Felix flew to Manila with 2 colleagues, carrying binders thick with stamped documents. At BPI Makati branch, a polite manager searched his terminal, frowned, and declared no such escrow accounts existed. Felix requested privacy, stepped into a hallway, and called a local fixer he had paid for years to supply rubber-stamped letters. The fixer's number rang dead. Panic at last prickled Felix's skin like cold sweat in tropical air. Back in Munich, auditors granted him one final grace: produce written confirmation within 5 days or face a qualified opinion that could endanger WireReach's banking licenses. Felix retreated to his office, blinds drawn against the Bavarian summer glare. He drafted a fake email chain between himself and a deputy governor of Banco Central, attached a PDF claiming balances of 1.9 billion euros, and altered metadata to mimic an old Lenovo laptop. He convinced himself this was merely buying time until genuine capital could be raised. Yet, in the act of saving the company, he crossed from embellishment into outright fabrication, an irrevocable step. On the morning of June 18, regulators, auditors, and company directors convened in WireReach's boardroom. Felix handed out the Philippine letters, heart pounding behind his tailored suit. A KPMG partner inspected the documents, then asked a simple question: why is the central bank seal the 2017 version when the letter is dated 2019? The room fell into a vacuum of silence. Felix's gaze drifted to the panoramic window, where clouds floated innocent and untroubled. Seconds stretched. Finally he spoke, voice barely above a whisper: there must be a printing error. The meeting adjourned in chaos. BaFin summoned police fraud investigators. The CEO fled to Vienna, citing stress leave. That evening Felix was arrested in his suburban townhouse while his children watched cartoons in the next room. He surrendered quietly, removing his glasses before the flash of the booking camera. WireReach's collapse was swift. Trading in its shares was halted. Nearly 20 billion euros in market value evaporated in 48 hours, scattering pensions and index funds across Europe. German newspapers, normally cautious, splashed the headline, "The money never existed." Employees queued outside the headquarters to collect belongings, some weeping, some furious, all bewildered by the revelation that success had been written in disappearing ink. At trial, prosecutors described Felix as the architect of a shadow ledger, conjuring profits to mask operational rot. Defense lawyers argued systemic pressure and executive collusion, painting Felix as the overworked caretaker of an impossible narrative. The court, unswayed, sentenced him to 9 years for accounting fraud and market manipulation, plus 5.5 million euros in disgorgement. As bailiffs led him away, Felix kept his gaze fixed ahead, perhaps counting for the first time in years, numbers that refused to bend. Each evening, commuters on the S-Bahn still passed the darkened wire-reach tower, its logo unlit but faintly visible against the night sky. Some glance up, remembering the euphoria of a modern German tech champion. Others avert their eyes, unwilling to relive how easily confidence can be built on silence, how 1.9 billion euro can fit inside a single Excel cell, and how the ghost of that empty cell now haunts Bavaria's glass corridors like a reflection no window washer can erase. London, 2013. Morning fog pressed against the mirrored walls of Aurora Capital, a mid-size hedge fund tucked between behemoth banks and Canary Wharf. Inside, fluorescent lights flickered awake, illuminating rows of identical desks where ambition clicked and scrolled before the city's buses had even hissed to their stops. Near the corner window sat Sarah Caldwell, an equities analyst of 34 whose calm pale blue eyes seemed to absorb numbers the way deep water absorbs light. She dressed plainly, navy dresses, low heels, no jewelry but a silver watch, but she carried the promise of extraordinary returns in the folders she slid across the conference table each Thursday. Sarah's edge, colleague's guest, was obsessive research. She spent nights parsing clinical trial journals, days courting mid-level scientists at biotech conferences. When Aurora bet on a drug maker, share prices often leapt within hours. The partners called her forecasts uncannily early, a phrase murmured with pride, not suspicion. Her annual bonus surpassed £1 million, yet her demeanor never changed. She still brought homemade sandwiches, still rode the DLR instead of a car service. The understatement only deepened her aura of mastery. What no one saw was the glow of a different screen on Sarah's kitchen counter at 2 a.m., a prepaid mobile, separate from the firm-issued BlackBerry. On that line came weekly texts from Dr. Jonas Rieger, a German oncologist contracted as a principal investigator for a drug trial codenamed Project Helios. He and Sarah had crossed paths at a Basel conference 5 years earlier, chatting over stale coffee about statistical endpoints. Their connection matured into something colder, more transactional. He fed her embargoed data. She wired funds to an account in Zurich titled Rieger Consulting. Each text was brief, clinical. PFS met. No SAE beyond grade 2. She translated the jargon into market certainty, then advised Aurora to increase its Helios stake. The trades were structured to look ordinary, positions spread across options, swaps, and cash executed through different brokers. Compliance software flagged nothing. For 18 months the profits rolled in, silent as snowfall, cumulatively worth £68 million to the fund and £3 million to Sarah in performance fees. She told herself no patient was harmed, no balance sheet fabricated. She framed the information flow as enlightened research, not theft. Trust, however, unravels on the gentlest thread. A junior compliance officer named Oliver Peck, newly transferred from a Big Four audit firm, was assigned to review voice line recordings for best execution checks. It was dreary work. Traders joking, cursing, confirming quantities. One Friday he stumbled upon Sarah briefing a portfolio manager. Her tone was steady, yet Oliver caught a medical acronym, overall survival, that sounded too granular for public domain. He replayed the clip twice, curiosity sharpening into unease. Oliver drafted a note for the head of compliance, then hesitated. Sarah's record was pristine, and he was 6 weeks into the job. The easier path was to delete the recording and forget the anomaly, but the phrase overall survival pulsed in his thoughts all weekend. Monday he sent the note, attaching a transcript and timestamp. Procedure activated, like a dim corridor suddenly lit. The firm's legal counsel contacted outside investigators. Regulators were tipped in confidence. Sarah was not informed. For 3 months, Aurora ran the sting in silence. Investigators mirrored Sarah's email, phone, badge swipes. Algorithms mapped her trades against public news releases, searching for glowworm correlations. A troubling pattern emerged. Positions entered 2 to 7 days before every Helios milestone, volume spiking at statistically impossible odds. The Financial Conduct Authority secured a dawn raid warrant but chose patience, wanting a final, irrefutable act. It came on a misty Tuesday in October. Jonas texted, "FDA nod imminent. Break even 95%. Sarah skimmed the message during a strategy meeting, excused herself, and hustled down the polished corridor to her desk. She placed orders totaling £120 million, aggressive all-in. Compliance flagged the surge but allowed it under her authorized limit. 2 hours later, security cameras captured 6 plainclothes officers entering the lobby. Sarah was reviewing a shareholder letter when they arrived at her station. One displayed a badge, another reached for the prepaid phone resting face down beside her keyboard. She did not resist. Colleagues watched in chilled silence as the woman whose calm had steadied half the floor was escorted away, coat still draped over her chair. Interrogation at the FCA offices unfolded with unsettling politeness. Sarah answered each question in measured sentences, almost as if narrating someone else's biography. Yes, she knew Dr. Rieger. Yes, she traded on his guidance. No, she had not considered it a crime, only an information advantage. When asked whether she felt remorse, she paused, stared at a water carafe, and whispered, "I thought accuracy was what mattered." News desks erupted. Headlines coined her the Canary Wharf Cassandra. To the public, insider trading usually conjured images of brash men shouting into headsets. The picture of a reserved woman in a navy dress appended expectations, made the story irresistible. Camera crews camped outside Aurora's glass facade, lenses fogging in London drizzle. The trial the following spring lasted 18 days. Prosecutors painted a stark line from private data to public profit. Defense counsel argued systemic ambiguity, saying the investment world thrives on nuance and whisper. The jury, half bewildered by science, half angered by privilege, deliberated only 5 hours. Verdict: guilty on 8 counts of insider dealing and conspiracy to commit fraud. Sentence: 4 years in prison, forfeiture of bonuses, lifetime ban from regulated markets. On the morning she was transferred to Downview Prison, Sarah looked out the van's small tinted window. The towers of Canary Wharf receded, their steel flanks gleaming in pale sunlight, indifferent as distant stars. She wondered whether the market would even hiccup at her absence. Inside Aurora, desks were reshuffled, new controls installed, Oliver Peck promoted quietly to senior compliance. Yet the traders still chased early signals, still believed in edges invisible to rivals. Every evening, commuter ferries glide along the Thames, past the luminous skyline where Aurora's floor lights burn late. Passengers sip coffee, scroll headlines, and seldom think about the faint electronic chime that once woke Sarah at 2 a.m. The signal of a text carrying secrets too early for daylight but perfectly timed for a trade. That chime has fallen silent, but in the hush after the ferry's wake, one might almost hear it, a reminder that in the glass canyons of finance, information moves faster than remorse, and sometimes faster than the law itself. Rotterdam, 2017. The Maas River slid past container cranes and placid gray sheets, mirroring the overcast sky that often cloaked Europe's busiest port. From the 14th floor of the Harborview Tower, Interglobal Shipping and Logistics managed routes spanning 5 continents. The company's pride was its Rotterdam Index, a weekly metric investors treated as gospel because it predicted freight rates with uncanny precision. The architect of that index was Oscar van Loon, 40, Director of Market Analytics, a man whose quiet politeness matched his tidy spreadsheets and pressed navy suits. Oscar had grown up within sight of the river, son of a tugboat captain. He traded the docks for Erasmus University, graduating with honors in econometrics. At Interglobal he rose swiftly, celebrated for models that shaved cents off every kilometer of distance, millions off annual fuel costs. Yet in 2016, when a younger outsider was promoted to Chief Strategy Officer, Oscar felt advancement slipping away. Recognition, like cargo, was drifting to newer vessels, and resentment started pooling within him like stagnant harbor water. The breach began with a private LinkedIn message from Darla Chin, an analyst at Triton Hedge London, praising Oscar's keynote at a shipping conference and asking whether he might expand on structural anomalies in the Baltic lane. Flattered, he agreed to a video call. Darla's curiosity turned surgical. How did Interglobal compile its Rotterdam index a full 48 hours before government customs data posted? Oscar demurred, laughing that he could not reveal trade secrets. She countered, what if insight met appreciation? An appreciation quantified as 15,000 euros per tip, wired to an Estonian fintech wallet under the alias Nautilus. Their first arrangement felt harmless. Oscar forwarded an innocuous email detailing vessel delays at port said. Triton placed derivative bets, and within days Darla messaged, we cleared 7 million. Thank you. The ease stunned Oscar. No code broken, no whispered bribe in a dark alley, just numbers exchanged for numbers. He vowed to stop immediately, yet the desire to prove his worth outside Interglobal tugged harder than conscience. Over the next 9 months, Oscar funneled over 30 pieces of embargoed data. Forward bookings from Chinese exporters, insurance claims hinting at typhoon damage, early drafts of the Rotterdam Index. Each tip arrived minutes after midnight when he accessed the company's Oracle server from his kitchen, pausing only to listen for his 2 children stirring upstairs. To mask the traffic, he used a VPN tunneled through Iceland and named the data packets after bird species. Albatross.csv, Heron.xls. Trust frayed when Interglobal's compliance analyst, Nora Bassi, noticed a peculiar rhythm. Every time Oscar logged in remotely, futures volume on Rotterdam freight swaps spiked in London within the hour. She charted the correlation, dots aligning like stars in an unmistakable constellation. Rather than raise alarms immediately, Nora instituted a covert audit, capturing Oscar's screen recordings under a maintenance pretext. She saved them on a thumb drive labeled Doc Permits, hidden in her desk's back panel. December arrived, and with it the year's pivotal data set, the Rotterdam Index Christmas projection, historically the market's most lucrative signal. Darla pressed Oscar harder than ever, promising a one-time bonus of 250,000 euros. He hesitated. Nora's shadow audit had slowed his nightly sessions, and guilt now flickered like a loose bulb. But ambition, once ignited, rarely dies quietly. On December 18 at 0:43, he decrypted the index, attached it to a zip file named kingfisher.zip, and hit send. Nor watched the file transfer in real time. The following noon, she walked to the office of CO Peter de Klerk, handed over the thumb drive, and spoke a single sentence. The index is leaving the building. Peter, a stoic former naval officer, ordered IT to trace the outbound packets. The trail pointed to the Icelandic tunnel, then to an IP hosted in Docklands, London, home to Triton Hedge. Interglobal contacted the Dutch Financial Markets Authority, who coordinated with Britain's FCA for a synchronized strike. They chose December 21st, minutes before Triton's expected windfall from Christmas freight bets. At 8:12 London time, FCA officers entered Triton's glass foyer. At 9:12 Rotterdam time, Dutch investigators stepped onto Harborview's 14th floor. Oscar was presenting a quarterly forecast when 2 men in gray suits approached. He recognized the FCA badge, skin draining of color like a photo losing saturation. Papers trembled in his hands. He offered no resistance, only muttering, "The model was mine," as if ownership justified the theft. News hit terminals worldwide within an hour. Insider freight leak rocks global shipping markets. Freight futures swung violently, wiping out gains Triton had amassed across the year. Interglobal's board suspended the Rotterdam Index pending review, causing investors to scramble for substitutes, none as precise. The port skyline looked unchanged, yet an invisible current of mistrust rippled through every container manifest. Oscar's trial in The Hague the following spring was swift. Prosecutors depicted him as a calculating mole. His defense cited stalled career prospects and the intangible nature of data. The judge, unmoved, likened market confidence to maritime safety, invisible until breached. Oscar received 3 years imprisonment and a €1.2 million fine, matching the sum Triton had wired. Darla Chin faced separate charges in Britain, her once promising career scuttled like a derelict ship. Back at Harborview, Noor declined a public commendation, content to return to her quiet desk overlooking the docks. Interglobal rebuilt the Rotterdam Index with triple encryption, But a trace of suspicion now lingered around every login, every remote access request. The Maas River still flowed, barges still queued beneath cranes, yet employees glimpsed betrayal in harmless spreadsheets, the way sailors sense hidden shoals beneath calm water. On certain damp mornings when foghorns echo across the harbor, workers recall that numbers, so clean on a screen, carry the weight of real steel containers, real ships, and real trust. And they remember Oscar Van Loon, the local prodigy who let ambition chart a secret course, only to run aground on data's unforgiving tide. Fort Lauderdale, Florida, 2009. Palm fronds danced in the Atlantic breeze as commuters eased down Los Olas Boulevard, past cafes where espresso machines hissed like tiny waves. On the 15th floor of the Bank of America Plaza, the law firm Rothman and Klein projected calm authority, walnut reception desk, muted art and floor-to-ceiling glass that framed the turquoise intracoastal. Its founding partner, Gregory Rothman, was 47, stocky, impeccably tanned, and fluent in the small courtesies that make people sign checks before wondering why. Gregory specialized in structured legal settlements. He negotiated big payouts for whistleblowers, medical malpractice victims, and employees wrongfully terminated by multinationals. The cash, he explained to clients, was placed in confidential structured annuities, managed through his firm's escrow accounts, guaranteeing annual yields north of 14%. Double a treasury bond, yet perfectly safe, because the settlements were backed by irrevocable court orders. Most clients accepted the story with grateful relief. They had already endured trial rooms and depositions, and Gregory's booming laugh felt like the end of pain. The first fissure formed at a beachside bar during spring break. A junior paralegal, Maria Diaz, noticed her firm's bookkeeper paying for drinks with a platinum card embossed Rothman Capital Holdings. The name echoed faintly in Maria's memory. A month earlier she had typed wire instructions for the same entity, believing it to be a brokerage. Curiosity tugged at her, mild but persistent, so she entered Rothman Capital into Florida's business registry. It revealed an address identical to the law firm's storage suite, and Gregory Rothman listed as sole officer. Meanwhile, Gregory's lifestyle spilled beyond discretion. He cruised Los Olas on a silver Bentley, hosted charity galas where A-list musicians serenaded invite-only crowds, and snapped up downtown condominiums for friends paying no rent. The glamour drew admiration, yet accountants in sensible shoes began whispering that structured settlement law was profitable, but not that profitable. Still, suspicion alone rarely bites. It needs a second set of teeth. Those teeth arrived in July, when a nursing home aide named Lillian Parker phoned the firm for an update on her $2 million discrimination settlement. She expected her first quarterly payment, $70,000, but no funds had appeared. The receptionist transferred her to Gregory, who answered with trademark warmth, blaming temporary clearing delays at the carrier bank. He promised a wire by Friday, then muted the call, eyes narrowing over spreadsheets swimming in red. Gregory's scheme had begun 4 years earlier as a bridge loan. He diverted $400,000 from one client's settlement to purchase a waterfront duplex, intending to flip it and replace the funds within weeks. The market sagged after closing. Replacement never happened. To plug the hole, he borrowed from a second settlement, then a third. Soon he realized the escrow pool, normally dormant between court approval and client disbursement, was an untapped ocean. He printed promissory notes on firm letterhead, fancy IOUs, while promising clients high yields, pending final structuring. Monthly interest checks to early victims came from fresh settlements. The classic Ponzi carousel spun smoothly beneath chandeliers. By 2009, the carousel required ever larger deposits. Gregory recruited local doctors and yacht brokers as private tranche investors, selling them shares in imaginary whistleblower awards. He lured them with steakhouse dinners, brandished redacted court orders as proof, and wired double-digit returns, until new money slowed and expenses did not. His Bentley needed servicing, his Boca Raton mansion required imported marble, and the gala circuit expectations he had built now demanded perpetual champagne. Back at the firm, Maria Diaz could not shake her unease about Rothman Capital. She confided in Jacob Levitt, a risk-averse associate fresh from Columbia Law. They examined closing files and noticed a pattern. Nearly every settlement, regardless of client or opposing counsel, flowed through a single City National Bank account ending in 8841, an account controlled not by the trust department but by Rothman Capital Holdings. Jacob's stomach tightened. Florida bar rules mandated that client funds remain segregated and interest on lawyers' trust accounts, never mingled with private entities. Jacob contacted the firm's outside auditors, who had rubber-stamped annual statements based on ledgers Gregory provided. He requested original bank confirmations. Within hours, Gregory's assistant alerted him. Auditors are asking for direct balances. Alarm jolted through him like ice water. He drafted a mass email to clients claiming cyber fraud had frozen escrow wires, then drove to the airport with a carry-on stuffed with bearer bonds and $200,000 in cash. The auditors, now alarmed themselves, called the FBI's white-collar unit in Miami. Agents subpoenaed the 8841 account and discovered a balance of $11,291, down from $93 million in supposed outstanding settlements. Funds had been wired to car dealerships, real estate escrow agents, luxury watch boutiques, and online casinos. The Bureau issued a federal warrant. Gregory was intercepted at Fort Lauderdale Hollywood International while purchasing a one-way ticket to Monaco. He surrendered quietly, sweat beading at his hairline despite the terminal's brisk air conditioning. News crashed over South Florida like a storm surge. Television vans lined Los Olas, reporters weaving metaphors of yachts and quicksand. Clients gathered outside the shuttered office clutching accordion folders of settlement paperwork suddenly worth less than the paper. One man shouted, "He bought my house with my own money." A truth both literal and tragic. At trial, prosecutors unveiled a timeline of greed. 431 victims, $412 million stolen or promised, $38 million recovered from asset seizures. They played voicemail snippets where Gregory spun tales of bank errors while transferring six-figure sums to a Casino de Monte Carlo account. The defense claimed conduct disorder compounded by workaholic stress, a plea that landed with the thud of an empty wallet. The jury convicted in 2 hours. The judge imposed a 50-year sentence, calling the offense a hurricane of betrayal. Today, Los Olas Boulevard still gleams under Florida sun, but people there speak of trust the way sailors speak of weather, something to monitor warily. The Bank of America Plaza has a new tenant. The 15th floor now houses a cybersecurity startup whose glass walls reveal only frosted silhouettes, as if transparency itself must be guarded. On humid evenings, when the intracoastal shimmers like spilled mercury, some former clients walk the promenade counting the monthly checks they no longer receive. They peer at the yachts bobbing in their slips and wonder which hulls were polished with their hopes. The water whispers back nothing, just reflects the city lights, bright, alluring, and for a time capable of masking a fortune built on shadow settlements. Brussels, 2014. Rain traced silvery veins down the glass facade of the Charlemagne building, where the Directorate General for Humanitarian Aid, DG ECHO, oversaw billions in emergency relief contracts. Inside, corridors smelled faintly of copier toner and espresso, and echoing footsteps blended with the soft murmur of multilingual briefings. Among the civil servants moved Etienne Verhaeghe, 51, head of procurement, his pinstripe suits offset by a modest wedding band and the habit of greeting even interns by name. He was regarded as the consummate bureaucrat, discreet, multilingual, incorruptible. Yet Etienne carried another identity concealed behind the dull glow of a government laptop. For 3 years he had steered tenders toward a Luxembourg shell called Stellamed Logistics, ostensibly a niche supplier of field hospitals. Stellamed appeared in contract files as a trusted partner, boasting warehouses in Rotterdam and Istanbul. In truth, the warehouses were little more than rented storefronts holding empty pallets, and Stellamed's sole shareholder was Melanie Favre, Etienne's college friend turned confidant, operating out of a tiny law office near Lake Geneva. The scheme began with a drought in the Sahel. DG ECHO needed mobile clinics fast. Etienne drafted a restricted tender, inviting only 3 firms. 2 existed. One, Stellamed, was birthed the night before the invitations went out. Stellamed won on cost efficiency, after Etienne inserted a footnote reducing required certifications, a change nobody questioned during the frenetic emergency. When invoices arrived, DG ECHO paid €14.8 million into a BNP Paribas account in Luxembourg. Real clinics were eventually delivered, purchased at half price from a Turkish wholesaler and routed through a maze of freight forwarders. The margin, roughly €6 million, stayed with Stella Med, then funneled through Melanie's office into Swiss portfolios marked Claire de Lune. The grift expanded cautiously. Typhoon shelters for the Philippines, cholera kits for Haiti, winter tents for Syria. Each contract small enough to hide inside 1,000-page budgets. Each profit slice just slim enough to slip beneath auditors' radar. Etienne rationalized the skimming as a facilitation fee for cutting red tape and delivering aid faster than bureaucracy ever could. He told himself children still received vaccines. Only the paperwork was padded. Trust frayed, as it often does, on a detail hardly larger than a staple. Lena Korhonen, a 27-year-old Finnish secondee, was tasked with digitizing archived tenders. While scanning Etienne's Sahel file, she noticed 2 consecutive pages where the footer font shifted from Calibri to Arial. Curious, she overlaid the PDFs. The altered pages inserted Stellamed's lower bid and the revised certification clause. Lena, whose mother ran a rural pharmacy, found the manipulation both clumsy and chilling. Instead of sounding alarms, she began a quiet audit. Evenings, after colleagues left for Trappist beers, Lena cross-checked vendor VAT numbers against open corporate registries. Stellamed traced to a Luxembourg mailbox shared with 33 shelf companies. Another vendor, Alpes Relief, linked to the same Geneva law office. Patterns emerged like tide marks. Identical legal phrasing, repeated banker signatures, contracts always routed through Etienne's desk. Unsure whom to trust, Lena contacted Olaf Kuhn, an investigator at OLAF, the European Anti-Fraud Office, whose business card she'd pocketed during orientation. She encrypted a dossier and pressed send, heartbeat loud against office hush. Olaf replied with a simple instruction: continue as if nothing has changed. For 2 months, Olaf mirrored Etienne's email and phone logs. They watched as Melanie forwarded dummy warehouse photos, as Etienne amended delivery milestones, as Stellamed pre-invoiced €9.2 million for Ebola isolation units, never yet assembled. Investigators needed a live catch, proof that funds left Brussels and resurfaced as personal gain. Opportunity arrived with a summit in Geneva. Etienne booked a single night at the Hotel d'Angleterre, citing a donor roundtable. Olaf alerted Swiss counterparts, who set up discreet surveillance. Cameras in the hotel lounge captured Etienne and Melanie toasting with Sancerre, passing a slim USB drive. Later, Melanie logged into a Zürcher cantonal bank portal and transferred €2 million from Stellamed to Claire de Lune Growth Fund, beneficiary, Verhaeghe. On a gray April morning, Etienne entered DG Echo clutching a croissant, unaware that plainclothes agents waited by the elevator. They approached gently. Reputation matters in Brussels, even at arrest. Etienne was escorted to a conference room whose blinds were already drawn. When shown wire diagrams tracing €8 into his private fund, he removed his glasses, polished them twice and whispered, "You must understand the aid still arrived." No one replied. News rippled across the continent faster than any policy communique. Headlines in Le Soir read, "Humanitarian aid, personal gain." Parliamentarians demanded safeguards. Tabloids ran split-screen photos of Sahel malnutrition beside Etienne's Lake Como vacation villa. DG Echo froze ongoing tenders and NGOs scrambled, fearing supply gaps on the front lines. The trial unfolded in the Palais de Justice, its neo-Gothic halls echoing with clicks of reporters' cameras. Prosecutors quantified the theft at €71 million across 9 contracts. Defense counsel argued bureaucratic inertia forced Etienne to innovate procurement, claiming the personal transfers were merely performance bonuses. The presiding judge, unimpressed, likened the logic to stealing water on the pretext of extinguishing a fire. Etienne received 8 years in St. Gilles prison and forfeiture of properties in Belgium, France and Italy. Melanie, tried in absentia, was sentenced to 5. Lena Korhonen declined interviews, requesting only a quiet posting to Nairobi, where she now oversees medical supply deliveries in person. Sometimes, unpacking crates in sweltering heat, she recalls Brussels rain sliding down glass. A reminder that transparency is precious and too often literal. Inside the Charlemagne building, procurement now runs on blockchain ledgers visible to every directorate. Yet civil servants still lower voices in corridors, acutely aware that safeguards are merely ink and code until someone chooses to heed a mismatched font. And on rainy evenings, when streetlights shimmer across wet Belgian pavements, Passers-by might glimpse their reflections and think briefly of funds meant for distant refugees that instead financed lakeside verandas. Proof that paper trails, though fragile, will eventually lead detectives and conscience back to the source. New York City, 2012. Dawn painted a pink crease between skyscrapers as coffee carts rattled toward Broad Street. 33 stories above, in the glass area of Sterling Capstone LLC, risk manager Daniel Armitage skimmed overnight emails while the cleaning crew still hummed vacuum lines into the carpet. Sterling, a mid-tier investment bank, made its living in the repo market. Overnight loans collateralized by U.S. Treasuries, an arena as bland to outsiders as sleep, yet capable of sudden, ruinous wake-ups. Daniel, 40, soft-spoken, carried a reputation for prudence so ironclad that traders called him the seat belt. But prudence can erode beneath ambition's slow drip. Daniel's bonus had stalled for 3 years while younger quants vaulted past him with flash trading patents and Ivy League bravado. One autumn evening, he lingered after the desks cleared and discovered a quirk in the firm's collateral allocation system. Repo trades booked after 7:58 p.m. bypassed an automated check that ensured every treasury pledged actually sat in Sterling's vault at the Federal. The glitch, a relic of Y2K coding, existed because nobody traded that late, except Daniel now saw a door ajar. The first maneuver was modest. He pledged a $50 million treasury note to German lender Hansa Bank, then reused the same cusp minutes later as collateral for a Japanese trust. Both loans would close before daylight. Overlap seemed invisible. The double pledge freed $50 million in cash, which Daniel quietly funneled into high-yield corporate bonds marked test blotter. Temporary, he told himself, a harmless arbitrage. By morning, he unwound both repos, returned funds, and nobody noticed. Success tasted like warm bourbon. Within weeks, Daniel scaled the gambit to hundreds of millions, rolling pledges across Tokyo nights and London dawns. The profits, thin individual slices yet compounding fast, flowed into a side pocket he labeled liquidity enhancement. Sterling's executives praised the newfound returns, mistook his calm for genius, and granted him a broader mandate. Trust frayed on an otherwise forgettable Tuesday. A junior operations analyst, Priya Singh, was reconciling cusp 912828BV when she found it pledged twice, 6 hours apart, to counterparties on different continents. Policy demanded escalation. She emailed Daniel, CCing no one. He replied at once, data feed timestamp error, already fixed. Priya almost accepted the answer, but the timestamp field looked hand-typed, lacking the usual millisecond precision. She saved a screenshot to a personal folder labeled oddities. Weeks passed. Priya noticed the pattern recur with other bonds, same 7:58 p.m. bypass window. She compiled a spreadsheet, 43 duplicates totaling $4.3 billion. Unsure whether she'd found a coding bug or something darker, she called the bank's anonymous ethics hotline after midnight, voice shaking. Internal audit triggered a covert probe, installing packet sniffers on Daniel's terminal and mirroring the repo ledger. What emerged over 4 nail-biting days stunned them. A daisy chain of reuse so dense that single treasuries backed as many as 8 simultaneous loans. The true collateral shortfall exceeded $9 billion, far larger than Sterling's equity. Auditors faced a dilemma. A public freeze could detonate counterparties, echoing Bear Stearns. They opted for stealth, informing the Federal Reserve at 5 a.m. Friday. Regulators, wary of contagion, coordinated an unannounced on-site exam. Agents in Navy suits filed through Sterling's revolving doors just as traders logged in for payroll Friday. Daniel was guiding a conference call when Compliance Director Elena Morales tapped his shoulder. She requested a private word. He followed, expression unreadable. In a sealed meeting room, regulators projected charts of looping pledges. Daniel stared, chest rising once, twice. Then he removed his badge, folded it, and set it on the table. I never touched client accounts, he said evenly. I meant to close the spread before quarter end. No one responded. News broke by lunchtime, Sterling Capstone under Fed review. Repo desks everywhere yanked credit lines. Funding costs spiked like a fever. By sunset, Sterling negotiated a weekend rescue with a larger rival at 10 cents on the dollar. Employees staggered out carrying cardboard boxes, reflections of emergency exit lights flickering in lobby marble. Daniel's arrest came Sunday dawn at his Upper West Side apartment. He opened the door in university sweatshirt and spectacles, looking more professor than criminal. In interviews he explained the scheme as borrowing efficiency, insisting the bank benefited. Prosecutors countered that overlapping collateral is the financial equivalent of selling the same house to 8 buyers. The indictment listed wire fraud, securities fraud, and conspiracy. Trial commenced the following spring in the Southern District's wood-paneled courtroom. Priya testified softly, eyes on the floor, recounting the decimals that betrayed him. Defense counsel argued Sterling's executives implicitly endorsed the trades by rewarding the profits. Jury members, mostly middle-class New Yorkers nursing 401k, listened stone-faced. After 3 days' deliberation, they returned guilty verdicts on all counts. The judge, quoting Hamlet, "Neither a borrower nor a lender be," sentenced Daniel to 12 years in federal prison and restitution of $68 million, the profit auditors could trace. Sterling's ex-CEO, though publicly shamed, walked free. Shareholders filed lawsuits that settled quietly. The glitch at 7:58 p.m. was patched in a single line of code. Priya declined offers from bigger banks, choosing instead a compliance role at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Some evenings she stands on the Brooklyn Heights promenade, watching Manhattan's towers shimmer across the East River. She knows behind those lights rest countless lines of code, any one of which could tilt trust off its axis. And somewhere upstate, in a low-slung prison beneath Maples, Daniel Armitage reviews newspaper clippings in the library, perhaps marveling that a seatbelt's duty is to restrain motion. Yet he, acclaimed for caution, became the very force that sent his firm careening into history.